Caroline. Carrie Whitaker needed just one thing on that winter morning. A job, so she could survive one more month in Chicago. She stepped out of her icy little rented room in a worn old blazer, her hands hiding their trembling deep in her pockets, carrying a hope as thin as a single thread. It was the interview at Northmark Logistics, a glass-bright building in the heart of downtown. Carrie was used to life knocking her down. She was used to days when she had to choose between rent and dinner. What she didn't know was that this day came with an invisible warning. Some places aren't meant for someone like her to walk into, and some doors aren't meant to be opened. The interview floor was strangely frigidand quiet. A long hallway, white lights, identical glass doors lined up like a maze. Room signs had been changed, directions were missing, and Carrie, not wanting to be late, simply walked a few steps faster. At the end of the corridor, one door stood slightly ajar. No nameplate, no voices. She drew in a breath, told herself it was just a waiting room, and pushed it open. In an instant, everything inside Carrie seized. A man in a dark suit lay slumped on the carpet, his face drained of color, his lips turning purple, his breathing torn into ragged fragments, as if life were being squeezed out of him. On the table, a glass of water had tipped over, and unfamiliar pills had scattered across the surface like fresh, still burning evidence. In the corner of the room, a camera blinked red, then went dead. The door behind her clicked shut with a dry, metallic sound, as if the room had just locked her inside its secret. Carrie didn't have time to be afraid. She lunged forward, dropped to her knees, called for an ambulance with hands shaking so hard they barely obeyed her, then put all her weight into the chest of the stranger to pull him back from the final line. She hadn't had the chance to understand why this was happening. She hadn't had the chance to understand why a room on a high floor of a transport company could smell so much like danger. Then the door burst open. Footsteps slammed in fast. A shadow surged into the room, and the cold mouth of a gun pointed straight at her. "Stand still." Carrie looked up, icy sweat clinging at her temples, but her eyes refused to bow. And in that moment, she still didn't know the name of the man she was fighting to save. He was Mason Riley, the kingpin the whole city whispered about like a curse. She didn't know, either, that opening the wrong door today didn't only save a life. It had just dragged her into a war the Mafia wouldn't call an accident, and the next thing being targeted might not be him, it might be her. If you find this story gripping, please hit like to support the channel. Don't forget to share it with your friends so they can follow what happens next, and subscribe so you don't miss our newest stories. The cold barrel of the gun held Carrie still, as if she'd been nailed to the floor, the metallic gleam flashing in her eyes for a single breath, and the man who'd burst in didn't hesitate, didn't ask who she was. He only looked at her the way you look at a threat that's crawled out of the dark. Carrie lifted both hands high, palms open and empty, her voice rough from calling for an ambulance while forcing a dying rhythm back into place, and her voice cut through the tension. "He's losing his rhythm. If you drag me out now, he won't last another minute. Stand back and let me stabilize him." The other man didn't lower the gun, but his eyes flicked over the motionless body, over the spilled glass, over the strange blister pack scattered near the table leg, then came back to aim straight at her forehead, as if one twitch would end everything. Footsteps pounded in the hallway outside, but the door behind Carrie didn't open. It stayed sealed tight, as if someone had just issued a remote command, that dry click still vibrating in her ears, and only then did she understand she hadn't merely stepped into a room, she'd stepped into a trap. An older man rushed in through a side entrance Carrie hadn't even noticed before, his white coat flaring, gloves already on and moving like lightning, and he dropped to his knees beside the man on the carpet, flipped an eyelid, checked a pulse, pressed a stethoscope, issuing orders in a voice that allowed no argument. "Get oxygen. Prepare the antiarrhythmic. Call the medical team now." Rafe kept the gun up, but his whole body had shifted into a protective stance, like an animal guarding its den, his eyes sweeping the room. The doctor looked at Carrie and didn't ask whether she was the culprit. He asked only what mattered. "What did you see before he went down?" Carrie swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I only saw him lying there. His lips were purple. His breathing was shredded. On the table, there was a glass of water and pills dropped like someone had hurriedly poured them into a hand and spilled them. Then, the camera blinked red and cut out, and the door behind me shut, as if it had been locked by someone else." The doctor paused for half a second, his gaze lifting to the corner of the ceiling, where the dark lens sat lifeless, like an eye that had been torn out. "Not an accident. he said very softly, but loud enough for Rafe to hear, and Rafe snapped toward the door at once. Tried the handle, tried the code, tried the card, all of it useless. Locked through the system. He growled, then looked at Carrie as if weighing her. Who told you to come in here? I thought it was the waiting room, Carrie said, forcing her voice not to shake even as her legs threatened to fold. The doctor pulled a small device from his pocket, pressed it to the man's wrist, read the numbers, then frowned. Arrhythmia. Signs of chemical stimulation, he muttered. Lifted a pill from the floor with gauze, studied the color, the smell, then slipped it straight into an evidence bag. Someone gave him something he shouldn't have swallowed. The air in the room thickened, as if oxygen had been quietly drained from everyone's lungs. Carrie heard her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, heard even the rasp of the doctor's gloves against skin, and she knew that from this second on, she wasn't a woman looking for a job anymore. Rafe pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal, or else someone had jammed the area, and he cursed under his breath, then gave an order to some voice through an earpiece. Carrie couldn't see. Lock down this floor. Shut off the elevators. Nobody goes up or down. The doctor pressed an oxygen mask to the man's face, injected medication, squeezed the bag, and at last a faint spasm ran through the motionless body like an answer. The man coughed and gagged, his eyes cracking open to a slit as thin as a thread, then closing again, but it was proof he hadn't left. Carrie let out a breath as if she'd survived death alongside him, but immediately Rafe yanked her back, his hand clamping her upper arm hard enough to hurt, hard enough to remind her she was still in the gun's shadow. You're not going anywhere, he said. You're a witness, or you're the reason. Carrie wanted to fight, wanted to say she was only lost, but the doctor's look made her fall silent. It wasn't suspicion, it was warning, as if he were telling her that in this room, the truth didn't protect anyone on its own. The man on the carpet parted his lips again, his breathing a wet rattle, as if he were trying to drag one word up from the bottom of his lungs. The doctor bent close. Rafe leaned in too, and Carrie tilted forward without meaning to, pulled toward that weak sound. The purple mouth moved, only a single syllable slipping out. Incomplete, indistinct, yet enough to make Rafe freeze as if a bucket of ice water had hit him. Declan. The name that slipped from Mason's lips hit the floor like a shard of glass. Not loud, but sharp enough to slice the air in the room. And Rafe's reaction was immediate. So fast Carrie felt like she was watching a machine switch modes. He didn't ask him to repeat it. He didn't explain anything. He only tightened his grip and pulled her all the way back toward the corner wall, stepping in front of her like a shield, his eyes sweeping the ceiling and all four sides with the clear alertness of someone who's used to counting danger by the breath. The doctor kept working to stabilize Mason, ordered a stretcher and equipment brought in through the side entrance, and this time that door opened in silence, as if it obeyed only a code Carrie had no right to know. When the medical team rolled the stretcher in, Rafe lowered the muzzle of his gun a little, but he didn't move away from Carrie, and she understood with perfect clarity that what was holding her there was no longer the metal in his hand, but an invisible system tightening around the room. Mason was lifted onto the stretcher, his breathing steady but heavy. Before the door closed, the doctor turned to Rafe with absolute gravity. This wasn't an ordinary collapse, Rafe. My readings show clear chemical interference. If we want him to live, we have to treat this as an attack, not an incident. The traces don't lie. Carrie heard every word. Her spine went cold, and in that exact moment, the decisive sound of shoes in the hallway landed like a period at the end of the word accident in her mind. A woman appeared in the doorway, a long charcoal coat, hair pinned neatly up, a face that didn't carry the panic of someone who'd just witnessed a life nearly lost, but the composure of someone accustomed to cleaning up after the worst things. Marlene Shaw didn't step in like she was asking permission. She stepped in like she was taking over. Her gaze moved quickly. Over the room, over the dead camera, over the sealed blister pack, then stopped on Carrie. Not cruel, but so clinical that Carrie felt as if every layer of skin on her body had been examined down to the bone. You're Caroline Whitaker, Marlene said, not as a question. Yes, Carrie answered, hoarse, forcing herself to stand straight even as her knees still wanted to buckle. Marlene gave a small nod, then turned to Rafe, her voice hard as an order. Let go of her, but don't let her leave this floor. Rafe hesitated for a single beat, then obeyed, his hand leaving Carrie's upper arm and leaving behind a dull ache like a fingerprint, and Carrie immediately rubbed the spot on instinct, Not because it hurt, but because she needed something, anything, to hold on to reality. Marlene signaled, and another security staff member brought over a sealed bag and a stack of papers. Procedure, Marlene said to Carrie, as if that one word could replace every explanation in the world. I need your cooperation. You'll tell me everything you saw, in the exact order. Then you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, and for your safety, your phone will be held temporarily. Carrie felt her throat burn with dryness. Temporarily for how long? Marlene looked at her as if deciding whether Carrie had the standing to ask that at all. Long enough for you to still be alive, she answered, then dropped her voice another notch. Not softer, sharper. You heard the name, he said, so you understand. This isn't a normal company. Carrie looked around, at a door that locked on command, at a private passage that opened only when someone wanted it to, at the eyes of people who weren't surprised to see a gun in an office hallway, and her heart sank like a stone. Marlene had her seated on a chair in the corner of a small adjacent conference room, where frosted glass covered just enough that no one outside could read the faces inside. Marlene leaned forward, her voice ice cold. Start from the beginning, Miss Whitaker. How exactly did you find yourself in a restricted penthouse office? Carrie met her gaze, forced her hands to stay still. I followed the signs, but they were wrong. The door was cracked open. When I pushed it, I saw him Mason on the floor. Then the camera died, and the lock clicked. I didn't just enter a room. I entered a trap. Marlene showed no reaction. She only wrote, occasionally asking for one word, one position, one direction of sight, as if rebuilding a map. When Carrie mentioned the camera, Marlene's pen stopped for exactly one beat, and it was the only beat in which she revealed that detail mattered more than all the rest. In the end, Marlene set an agreement in front of Carrie. Long, straight lines of legal language like a steel fence. And Carrie skimmed it and saw her name. Saw the clause forbidding disclosure. Saw the consequences if she violated it. Saw even the phrase for reasons of personal security, which sounded like protection and yet weighed like a threat. She signed because she couldn't see any other choice. And when the security staff member held out the sealed bag, Carrie placed her phone inside, feeling as if she were handing over with her own hands the only cord still tying her to the normal world. Marlene stood, adjusted her collar, and looked at Carrie one last time. You'll be taken home tonight. Someone will go with you. Don't call anyone. Don't tell anyone anything. And if you want to keep living in this city, you need to learn when to be quiet. Carrie opened her mouth to ask why me, but the question snagged and died, because Marlene was already walking out, leaving behind a faint perfume and a terrifying certainty that everything had been arranged. That night, when Carrie lay on her old bed in her rented room, the window patched with tape and plastic because the wind cut through, her phone no longer in her hand to call anyone, only a backup device they'd given her to contact when necessary, the screen suddenly lit up with a message from an unsaved number, a single line without a period, like a whisper against the back of her neck. Don't tell anyone about the camera. That night, they didn't take Carrie home in a regular taxi the way she'd assumed, but in a dark vehicle pulled tight to the curb, the rear windows tinted and without a single sign of any service, as if the car had been made for one purpose only, to pass through streets other people weren't meant to remember. The driver didn't say a word. The man seated beside the back door only gave a short reminder that she'd be taken all the way home, that this was for her safety, and that from this moment on, she wasn't to repeat what she'd seen to anyone. Not to friends, not to neighbors, not to family. Carrie nodded, because she understood nodding was the only way not to turn herself into a problem. But inside her, a wire was tightening, a feeling she couldn't name, like the certainty you get when someone is standing behind you and you know it before you ever turn around. The car moved through cold blocks of the city, streetlights stretching into long streaks across the glass, and Carrie tried to look out and anchor herself to something familiar in Chicago, but everything slid by like a film with the sound stripped away. She could hear only her own heart, and Marlene's words repeating in her head like steady knocking. Be quiet at the right time, long enough to still be alive. At an intersection, the car slowed and turned, and at that exact moment, Carrie caught another pair of headlights in the rearview mirror, not too close, but persistent, clinging like a shadow. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. There were thousands of cars out at night in this city. But after they turned 2 more times, the headlights were still there, holding the perfect distance, not close enough to be obvious, not far enough to disappear. Carrie felt her throat go dry. She didn't dare ask. She didn't dare point. She only tightened her grip on her bag in her lap, as if safety could fit inside it. The man beside her glanced at her for a moment, then looked back out the window, his mouth set, and with that small reaction alone, Carrie knew she wasn't imagining it. The dark car picked up speed slightly, then suddenly changed lanes, cutting toward a side route, and the headlights behind slowed as if weighing a choice, then followed anyway, as if the game had been calculated in advance. The driver spoke for the first time, his voice low and blunt. "Don't turn around." That sentence chilled the back of Carrie's neck more than the winter wind. They went on a little farther. Then the car swung suddenly into a small parking area and killed its lights for a few seconds. Carrie's heart nearly stopped in that pocket of darkness. The other headlights passed the mouth of the lot, slowed, swept once as if searching, then continued straight and vanished at the end of the street. The man beside Carrie let out a breath, but he didn't reassure her. "Just a warning," he said, like he was reciting something he'd memorized. "Remember what you were told." Carrie didn't answer, because her mouth wouldn't produce sound. When they stopped in front of the worn old building where Carrie rented her room, the man who escorted her out didn't come inside. He only stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the dark windows, as if checking whether someone was watching. Carrie fumbled for her key, her hands shaking so badly the metal scraped and clicked against itself. "Go up," he said. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." Carrie stepped into the hallway that smelled of damp plaster, climbed the stairs with the feeling of eyes on her back, and when she finally got into her room, she slid the lock twice, then stood with her back against the door, trying to take a long breath, but her lungs wouldn't seem to fill. The rented room was the same as always, cramped, cold, the old heater rattling, the thin curtain at the window trembling with a draft. Carrie turned on the light, and the weak yellow glow made everything look even poorer. And it was that very poverty that made her feel absurdly small, dragged into a world where someone could lock doors remotely and kill cameras as easily as flipping a switch. She'd barely set her bag down when the backup device they'd given her vibrated, the screen lighting up, a line of text appearing from an unnamed number. "Don't tell anyone about the camera." Carrie stood frozen, staring at the words the way you stare at a knife laid against your throat. She hadn't even managed to exhale when outside there came a short hiss of wind, then a brutal crash that tore the night open. Carrie jolted and whipped around. Her window exploded into fragments, small shards spraying inward like rain, pattering onto the wooden floor and the edge of the bed, and a surge of cold air rushed in, making the lamp tremble. Carrie screamed on reflex and immediately clapped a hand over her own mouth, her heart hammering out of rhythm, her eyes sweeping the room to see whether someone had come in with the stone. But there was no one, only a rock lying in the middle of the floor, rough and dirty, and beneath it a scrap of paper folded in haste, its edge nicked and scratched by glass. Carrie moved closer, her legs feeling like they didn't belong to her, lifted the paper with 2 trembling fingers, opened it, and read a single line scrawled in black ink: "Save him and keep your mouth shut." No one was hurt, but Carrie felt as if she'd just been slapped across her pride, across the naive belief that doing the right thing meant you'd be protected. She took a step back and looked out through the jagged hole rimmed with teeth of glass, saw the alley below, dark and empty, only a distant street lamp and the occasional passing car as if nothing had happened. And only then did Carrie understand with brutal clarity that someone didn't need to kill her to win. They only needed to frighten her until she erased herself, until she stepped back from every question, until she swallowed the secret together with her panic, and most of all, until she learned to be silent before she could ever become a problem in their game. The next 2 days passed like a low, lingering fever. Carrie taped plastic sheeting over the shattered window frame with cheap tape, swept the tiny glass splinters off the floor, and tried to convince herself it was only a scare tactic to keep her quiet, that if she stayed quiet, it would all pass. But that silence didn't bring peace. It only made the little rented room feel smaller, colder, and made her fear grow bigger, because every set of footsteps in the hallway sounded like someone stopping at her door, and every hard break on the street below made her flinch as if her name had been called. She barely slept, only dozing in short, broken stretches, then jerking awake when the wind slapped the plastic with a frantic flutter, like someone knocking without needing permission. On the morning of the second day, her landlord texted for the rent, sharp and indifferent, reminding her that whether the Mafia world was hunting her or not, life still had ordinary, ruthless things, like payment deadlines, like the electric bill, like a hungry stomach that waited for no one. Carrie stood in front of the mirror, looked at the dark circles under her eyes, looked at her lips cracked from the cold, and wondered what she'd done wrong when all she'd tried to do was save a stranger. The backup device sat on the table and vibrated again and again throughout the day, only to display short, nameless messages, sometimes nothing at all, sometimes a single word like a hook, and then by late afternoon it rang, a shrill sound that made Carrie nearly drop her glass of water. She stared at the unfamiliar number, her heart pounding, but she answered anyway, because helplessness felt even more terrifying than the call. The voice on the other end was a woman's, clear and without emotion, introducing herself as calling from Northmark Logistics, saying they needed Carrie to be at the building tomorrow morning, on time, to go straight to the front desk and give her name. Carrie tried to ask why, but the voice cut in as if the answer had been prepared in advance. Not an interview, a job placement. Carrie felt ice spread across her back. I haven't accepted anything. You will hear the offer, the woman said, and you should come. The call ended, leaving a long tone like a wire pulled tight. Carrie sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the threatening note, still tucked in her coat pocket. Remembered the rock, remembered the dead camera, remembered the gun aimed at her forehead, and she understood this wasn't a polite corporate invitation. It was another door being opened for her, and if she didn't step through, she didn't know what would come looking for the door of her torn, shabby room next. The next morning, Carrie put on the same old blazer again, even though it still carried the dust smell of broken glass, and stepped out into the skin cutting cold. She took the train, watched the anonymous faces around her, and wished she could be as anonymous as they were, but the feeling of being watched clung to her like smoke. When she reached Northmark, the front desk didn't send her up to human resources the way they had before. They made one brief call, and a moment later, someone came down to meet her. That person led her to a private elevator. No buttons for outsiders, only a keycard scanner, and each floor slid past in silence, as if she were going deeper into the belly of a beast. They brought her into a small conference room with frosted glass and white light, and on the table a bottle of water had already been set out beside a thick, sealed envelope. Marlene Shaw was waiting there, back straight, both hands resting neatly on a file as if Carrie were only a line on a list that needed handling. "You're on time," Marlene said, neither praise nor criticism. Carrie sat, feeling the chair's cold seep through thin fabric, and asked bluntly, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "Why am I here?" Marlene opened the file and slid a printed job description across to her. The title read, Crisis Communications and Operations Support, and beneath it was a salary that made Carrie think she'd misread it. It was so high it could wipe out rent debt, replace the window, buy food without counting every dollar. The shock almost made her laugh at the absurdity, but suspicion tightened around her throat right after. "Why me?" Carrie asked, her eyes locked on the number. Marlene met her gaze. "Because you kept your head in a situation where others would run. Because you know how to say the right thing to the right person. And because you're within the radius of a matter you shouldn't stand outside." Carrie gripped the paper, her fingers stiff with cold. "I don't want to be involved." Marlene tilted her head, and if there was a smile, it was only a straight line. "You've been involved since the moment you opened that door." She drew the sealed envelope closer to Carrie. "This is from Mr. Riley." Carrie stared at the envelope, the way you stare at something that might explode. She opened it, and inside wasn't a contract, but a thick piece of paper with tidy handwriting. So few words it felt frightening. "As long as you're in my sight, you live." Carrie read the sentence again and again, feeling as if someone had just placed a collar around her neck and called it protection. And when she looked up, Marlene was watching her as if she already knew what Carrie would choose. "You can refuse," Marlene said evenly, "but I don't recommend it." Carrie swallowed hard, looked through the frosted glass, saw the outline of security standing motionless in the hallway, and in her mind the rock returned, the note, the sound of glass breaking. She understood she was facing an offer that wasn't an invitation, but a marked path to survival, and the price of it was staying within the sightline of a man who had nearly died and still held enough power to decide who was allowed to live quietly in this city. On the first day, Carrie walked into Northmark as an employee. It didn't feel like the beginning of a new job. It felt like she was signing a contract with a storm, the slim access badge in her hand heavy as granite, and Mason's words still hooked in one corner of her mind like iron. "As long as you're in my sight, you live." Marlene led her down bright, cold corridors without any elaborate introductions, only assigning a desk, access permissions, and a schedule packed so tightly it was as if Carrie had been here for months, then stating, simply, that Carrie's role was emergency communications and operations support, meaning she'd read, write, edit, smother, and if necessary erase every spark before it became a wildfire. Carrie nodded, keeping her face calm, but she could feel every gaze sliding over her a beat slower, the kind of gaze people don't give a new hire, but a story. She heard whispers pause as she passed, then start again once she was out of sight, like bees clustering around a drop of blood. That very morning, the first crisis arrived so fast it didn't give her time to learn the printer or find the break room. A small finance blog posted a coy piece suggesting Northmark's top executive had been hospitalized in critical condition, followed by poisonous speculation that the company was hiding a collapse, that major contracts would fall apart, that competitors were waiting to tear it apart. Within hours, it was reshared across social media, pulling along gleeful comments from people who liked watching someone else fall. Julia from Internal Communications dragged Carrie into an emergency meeting, her voice tight and faintly disdainful, like someone forced to use a chess piece she didn't trust. On the screen, headlines kept refreshing. The desk phone vibrated without stopping. Everyone in the room tossed ideas like stones into a river, too loud, too scattered. Carrie took it in at a glance, then she silenced the room. Stop arguing with emotion. We need to seal these leaks with cold corporate facts, not a plea for belief. Silence them with authority. She suggested a short statement. No mention of a hospital, no confirmation of condition, only an assertion that operations were stable. The leadership team was functioning normally, contracts were secure, and anything unverified was speculation. She also proposed a small but effective step: release a neutral internal image, a scheduled operations meeting, with a digital signature from the coordination unit to prove the machine was still running without parading whether the boss was alive or dead. Julia watched her as if measuring whether she was confident or reckless. But in the end, she still sent the draft to Marlene for approval. 15 minutes later, the statement went out, and at the same time, legal sent a takedown demand to the blog for sourcing nothing, and the flow of rumor began to slow, not vanish, but clog, like a stream meeting a boulder. Carrie sat down after the meeting, her wrists aching from fast typing, and in that brief moment, she felt the only thing she'd always been good at, standing straight when others staggered. But the feeling didn't last, because when she stepped into the hallway to get water, she caught a cluster of employees near the coffee machine looking at her and then looking away, and the whisper reached her like trash hitting the floor. That CPR girl, I heard she got brought up in the private elevator. Who gets that? And a small laugh slipped out. Not loud, but enough to make Carrie's face burn. She didn't turn back. She didn't react, because she'd learned long ago that arguing with a cruel mouth was cutting yourself with someone else's knife. But each word still lodged in her like thorns. That afternoon, Marlene sent her an internal folder and told her to review a few operations documents that could leak if the rumor kept spreading. And when Carrie opened it, she saw spreadsheets labeled with routes, container codes, port schedules, the kind of thing that sounded like pure logistics, but certain terms repeated with an odd insistence, phrases that looked meaningless for freight and yet had been marked high priority, and notes written in a circling kind of language, as if something else was being hidden under a legal coat. Carrie didn't fully understand it, but instinct told her this was a basement under the house, the sort of thing they didn't let a new person see without a reason. She closed the folder, her heart slowing, and reminded herself her job was communications, not decoding darkness, but the darkness had already placed itself on her screen. At the end of the day, when she went down to the lobby to return a temporary visitor badge to security, she heard two guards talking quietly, their tone like ordinary workplace chatter, and yet it sent cold down Carrie's spine. One complaining about having to update a new contractor list for the camera system of an elementary school, the other answering that Piper's school had just switched contractors, so the next few days might have system glitches. They'd better watch it, or it would get reported upstairs. Carrie froze for a beat, the name Piper dropping into her chest like a bell. And even though she hadn't met the child, even though she only knew Piper was Mason's daughter from a few brief remarks, she still felt a vague premonition rise, that in this city, what people touched to win wasn't money or reputation. It was the softest things, the things even the most powerful man couldn't lock away behind a door. The next morning, Carrie walked into the building feeling as if she were crossing a thin wire stretched between two rooftops. Whispers, and the things she still didn't fully understand in those logistics documents far below her, and ahead of her the name Piper, which had slipped into her hearing by accident like a bad omen wrapped in a guard's calm voice. She told herself she had no right to imagine too much, that a hallway conversation couldn't become fate. But when the elevator carried her up to her floor, the backup device in her pocket gave a faint vibration, as if reminding her that since the night her window shattered, even the smallest thing could be tinder. She'd barely set her bag down when Julia messaged her to go to the cafe counter on the ground floor to pick up printed materials for a meeting, and Carrie went immediately, wanting to keep herself busy so she wouldn't think about the dark. The morning cafe was crowded, the smell of hot coffee and pastries making her remember the rare ordinary days in her life, the days when she could walk through a door freely without fearing it would lock behind her. She was waiting for a cup of water when a man's voice sounded beside her, warm and polite, the voice of someone who seemed to know nothing about violence. "Miss Whitaker, right?" Carrie turned and saw a tall man dressed with such exacting correctness. He looked as if he'd been cut from a business magazine. A dark coat, an expensive watch that didn't flaunt itself, a smile friendly enough to make you think you'd been singled out for favor. His gaze didn't lunge. It measured, as if keeping time, as if weighing an object. "I'm Declan Voss," he said, offering his hand. Carrie had heard that name from Mason's lips, but she didn't let her face change. She only shook once, briefly, then withdrew, feeling as if she'd touched a velvet-wrapped blade. "I heard you handled yesterday's rumor situation cleanly," Declan continued. Praise kept light. "Northmark needs people who know how to stay calm." Carrie thanked him and started to turn away, but Declan walked alongside her with an ease that suggested they'd always shared the same path. "Let me buy you a coffee," he said. "A welcome, and also so I can understand the person who made the whole building stir up last week." The last line was delivered like a joke, but Carrie felt her palm go cold. She remembered Marlene's warning, remembered the non-disclosure agreement, remembered the threatening messages, and understood that no conversation here was accidental. "I have work," Carrie said, keeping her tone from turning sharp. Declan smiled as if he'd expected that. "Just a few minutes. I promise I won't take more time than you already spent saving someone." He ordered without asking what she wanted, a hot black coffee and a bottle of water, then chose a table by the glass, looking out to the street, where daylight made everything look cleaner, safer. Carrie sat across from him, back straight, both hands resting on her lap like she was in a second interview, except this time she knew the man opposite her didn't need a lawful reason to hurt her. Declan started with harmless talk about the company, about shipping schedules, about how rumors could panic the market, and Carrie answered with just enough, not one extra word. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice lower, like a confidant. "How's Mr. Riley these days?" Carrie held his gaze. "I'm not authorized to discuss an executive's health." Declan gave a small laugh. "You really do know the rules." He took a sip of coffee, then asked as if it were casual, "How's that Myriand? And what about that room? The one on the high floor, where the camera died at the perfect moment, where the door locked like someone was controlling it. How did you get in there?" The space between them felt like it had been emptied of air. Carrie kept her face still, but inside her, the sound of shattering glass seemed to echo back. "I went in by mistake," she said, "and I signed an agreement. I'm not saying more." Declan set his cup down so gently it made no sound, but his eyes darkened by a shade, the courtesy still on his mouth, only it no longer reached his gaze. "You know," he said, still soft, "around here, sometimes people don't need you to talk. They just need to know you know." Carrie felt her ribs tighten like wire. "I just want to do my job," she answered. Declan nodded, as if agreeing. "Then I'll be direct." He slid a small card across the table, not a normal business card, but a plain piece of stock, with only a phone number and a single letter, D. "If you want real protection," he said, "you call that number. I can make sure you won't have to tape plastic over your window again. I can also help you move up a lot faster than trying to hold yourself together under a few whispers." Carrie looked at the card as if it were a neatly placed trap, and she pushed it back, very slowly, very clearly. "No," she said. Declan didn't move, the smile still hanging there, but his eyes were so cold in that moment Carrie understood courtesy was only a coat. "You're stubborn," he said, his voice still smooth. "I like stubborn people, but you should understand one thing." He tilted his head, studying her like someone standing in the wrong place. "You don't know who you're standing between." Carrie swallowed hard, feeling as if the chair beneath her had turned to ice, and when she stood to leave, Declan added one last line, light as wind and heavy as stone. Don't let your kindness become the reason someone else pays the price. Carrie walked away without looking back, but every step sounded to her like knocking on the edge of a deep hole that had just opened under her feet. Carrie left the cafe counter with bitterness still clinging to her tongue even though she hadn't taken a single sip, the card with the letter D like a smudge she'd just pushed back, and Declan's last sentence chasing her down the long corridor. Don't let your kindness become the reason someone else pays the price. She told herself she had to forget it, had to focus on work, had to live like a shadow inside this system until she could leave safely. But the more she tried to shrink, the more she felt an invisible hand tightening a cord around her throat. That morning, her inbox received a reminder for an urgent meeting with the head of operations, the subject tied to media response and internal process. The time clearly displayed, and Carrie didn't doubt it for a second. She printed the materials at once, highlighted the key points, checked every line the way people check a safety harness before stepping off a cliff. She arrived early, stood outside the meeting room door the proper way, waiting to be called in, but when the wall clock crept past the start time, the door stayed closed and no one summoned her. Carrie looked again at the email, then at the calendar system, and in that moment cold ran straight down her spine because the time on the calendar had changed. The meeting had been moved earlier, and under the new schedule, she was late. Late, not because she was lazy or careless, but because someone had edited the meeting after the notice went out. Edited it just enough to spring a tiny trap labeled unprofessional. The door swung open, and the head of operations stepped out, his face flat, his eyes sharp, looking at Carrie the way you look at a system error that needs to be removed. "Miss Whitaker," he said, not loud, but loud enough to slow down the people passing by. "Do you think my time is cheap?" Carrie felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice calm, apologized and said the meeting time had been changed, that she had the original notice. His mouth curled as if she'd told a joke. "Here, you're responsible for being on time, not for whether you have a reason." He walked away and left one more line behind him, like a label pressed onto her forehead. "Next time, don't make excuses." Carrie stood there with her fingers gripping the packet so hard the cover bent, her ears ringing with the rush of blood, and she could feel the eyes around her ready to laugh, ready to judge, ready to pin another new story onto her. She went back to her desk, opened the calendar system, checked the change log, but her access level wasn't high enough to see who had edited it. She could only see a neat little line stating the calendar had been updated by Administrator, a nameless shadow. Julia walked by, flicked a glance at her and looked away, not asking, not defending, as if Carrie had ruined herself and deserved to be left there. Carrie sat down, drew a slow breath in, reminded herself this was only a small strike, a scratch, but any scratch could fester if someone wanted it to. She was about to call Marlene to report it, then stopped, because some part of her understood that if she ran to be rescued for every small trap, she'd turn herself into someone who needed rescuing, and that was exactly what they wanted, to make her the weak one, the panicked one, the suspicious one. She chose silence. She chose memory. And in that moment, the backup device buzzed in her pocket like a quiet warning, but the screen showed no message, only a meaningless vibration that made her shiver. Late in the afternoon, as the hallways began to empty, Carrie left her office with her mind heavy, not only because she'd been reprimanded, but because of the feeling of being steered, pulled into a game whose rules had no name. The elevator arrived. She stepped in with a few strangers. The doors closed. The light inside the car was so white it made every face look pale. She watched the panel, pressed her floor, then stepped back into the corner, trying to turn herself into part of the wall. The elevator stopped midway, and another man stepped in, wearing a plain jacket, no employee badge, a baseball cap pulled low, a face so ordinary it was forgettable. He stood beside Carrie, too close, close enough that she could smell cold cigarette smoke clinging to his fabric. Carrie went rigid, eyes forward, refusing to turn, but she felt him tilt his head. When the elevator started moving again, he leaned to her ear, breath warm, words cold as biting as glacial ice. "Some people disappear for opening the wrong door." Carrie didn't flinch. She didn't look at him. She didn't give her fear away. She only tightened her grip on her bag strap and kept her breathing steady, as if she were standing in a hard wind. The stranger stepped out on the next floor and blended into the hallway as if he'd never existed. The elevator doors shut, and in the mirrored metal around her, Carrie saw her own face, pale but rigid, like someone who'd just been sentenced and still wasn't allowed to fall. She didn't need anyone to explain it anymore. 2 blows in a row, a small trap in the meeting schedule and a whisper against her ear, carried the same scent of false politeness she'd tasted at the cafe, and in her mind the letter D appeared, sharp as fresh ink. Declan didn't need a gun to warn her. He only needed to remind her that here, any door could lock, and anyone could make her vanish if she stood on the wrong side of them. The next morning, Carrie walked into the office feeling like she'd survived a night with no visible blood. But the sentence from the elevator still rang in her head like a bolt sliding into place, and as she was trying to focus on her screen, an email from the administrative assistant appeared, so brief it felt indifferent, requesting that she come to the top floor late this afternoon. The location clearly listed as the executive penthouse. No reason, no context, only one emphasized line that she had to be on time. Carrie stared at the email for a long moment, and it felt as if all the whispers around her drifted far away, because she understood the only person who could summon her like that without explanation was the one the entire building had been trying to hide the life and death of. All day she worked like a machine, answering a few internal media questions, revising a section of a statement, avoiding her coworkers' curious eyes, and every time her fingers touched the keyboard, she remembered the paper in the envelope. As long as you're in my sight, you live, as if the sentence were hauling her upward on a rope she hadn't tied herself. At the appointed time, the private elevator opened after she scanned her badge, the car empty and silent. No music, no advertisements, only white light and the pull of cables like breathing. When the doors opened at the penthouse level, the air changed at once. So quiet she could hear her shoes on the carpet. A wide corridor, black glass, polished wood, the scent of cleanliness and power, as if up here no one needed to speak loudly because everything already listened. A guard stood at the office door, checked her badge again, then opened it without knocking. Carrie stepped in and saw Mason Riley standing by a broad window looking down over the city, late afternoon light slanting across his dark jacket, sharpening the lines of his face, making them colder, but also revealing fatigue like a crack hidden under stone. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and in that moment, Carrie understood why people called him a kingpin even when he did nothing to prove it. His presence alone changed the air into law. "You came," Mason said, his voice low and even. No warmth of thanks, only assessment. Carrie stood a few steps away, keeping her hands from clenching, keeping her voice from shaking. "You sent for me." Mason gave a small nod and pointed to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Carrie sat, back straight, eyes steady, but her heart felt heavy because she had the sense she'd stepped into an interrogation where the man asking didn't need long answers. Mason watched her for a moment, eyes dark as deep water, then asked directly, without ornament, like a blade leaving its sheath. "Have you talked?" Carrie didn't ask what he meant, because they both knew. "I haven't told anyone," she said. "I signed the agreement, and I don't trade other people's stories for my own safety." Mason tilted his head slightly, as if hearing what he wanted to hear, then asked again, his tone still even, but each word weighted heavier. "Has anyone approached you?" The image of Declan, with his polite smile, flashed through Carrie's mind, along with the whisper in the elevator, the meeting schedule trap. And she chose care. Not because she feared Declan, but because she understood that naming anyone in this room was like throwing a stone into still water. It would make waves, and it could make blood. "Someone tried to scare me," Carrie said. "My window was smashed, and someone reminded me about opening the wrong door." Mason's expression didn't change, but the hand resting on the edge of the desk tightened just slightly, so small, it was the only sign he was controlling something that wanted to flare in his chest. "You're still here," he said. "So what do you want?" The question caught Carrie for a beat, because people usually asked what she wanted only to refuse her, while this man asked as if he could give it, and that was what made it frightening. Carrie drew a breath. "I want to do the job I was hired to do. I don't want to be dragged into a power game. I don't want anyone using me to fight each other." Mason looked at her, then let out a very short laugh, without joy. "You talk like you have the option to stay outside." He stepped closer, not crowding her, but close enough for Carrie to feel his weight in the room. "Listen carefully, Whitaker. That wasn't a heart attack. That was a failed assassination." Carrie felt her skin go cold even though she'd guessed it. Mason continued, his voice dropping like stone. Someone wanted me dead in that room, in silence, no camera, no witness, and you walked in at exactly the wrong moment." Carrie swallowed hard, remembering the pills, the locked door, the dead camera. "So, what do you want me to do?" Mason looked out the window for a second, then turned back, his gaze sharp. "You do your job," he said. "You keep this story from blowing up. You write, you edit, you smother rumors in a way that keeps outsiders from smelling blood. Be silent the right way, understand?" Carrie felt her throat tighten, not because of the task, but because the truth was her job now wasn't only communications, it was paint laid over a war. "And in return?" she asked. Mason looked at her as if the question were both naive and fair. "In return, you stay alive," he said. Then added slowly, like a warning wrapped in calm. "And you won't be alone in this." Carrie opened her mouth to say she didn't want protection like that, but Mason lifted a hand and stopped her with a small motion. "One more thing," he said. And for the first time something softer flickered in his eyes, very briefly, like reflected light. Then it was gone. "Piper wants to meet you." Carrie went still, the name striking her like a drumbeat. And in that moment she understood Declan's pressure wasn't aimed only at her. It was aimed at the one thing that could make a man like Mason lose control. Carrie had thought she'd have time to prepare for that meeting, time to steady her breathing, time to find a reasonable explanation in her own head for why a new employee would be summoned to the private home of the man at the top. But Mason didn't ask whether she was ready. He simply sent an address and a time, and on Saturday night, the familiar black car pulled up in front of her boarding house like a period at the end of every pretense of normal. On the ride over, Carrie looked through the window as the city flowed past like dark water, and inside her was a strange tension. Not quite the same fear as before, but the sense that she was stepping into another room, a room without a dead camera, but one that could lock a person's heart with softer things. The gate to the estate opened after a quick check, the fence high, the trees trimmed clean, warm yellow lights laying a quiet luxury over the stone path, and Carrie realized the wealth here didn't need to show off. It only needed to exist to make everyone else feel small. Rafe met her at the door, his face still hard as stone, but this time he didn't point a gun. He only nodded and led her inside. Everything within was so clean and so quiet. Carrie heard her own footsteps more clearly than her heartbeat. A wide living room, neutral walls, carefully chosen furniture, no visible chaos of a home with a child if you only glanced. As if someone had tried to keep everything perfect so it wouldn't brush against memory. Mason stood at the end of the hall. Not in a suit, only a dark sweater and dark trousers, a little less of a kingpin in appearance. But his eyes were the same, sharp and assessing, like a man always thinking one step ahead. "You're here," he said, and Carrie nodded, unsure whether to use an office voice or something more human. She hadn't even managed another word when the sound of running feet pounded from deeper inside, a small storm breaking the silence that money and discipline had built. "Dad, is it her? Is it?" A little girl shot out of the hallway like an arrow, brown curls bouncing, wearing dinosaur pajamas, and before Carrie could even bend down, the child wrapped both arms around her, hugging her with the certainty of someone who'd known her a long time, as if Carrie were a missing piece in a picture. Carrie froze, then instinct took over and she hugged back. The small body pressed against her, making something in her chest go soft, an emotion she hadn't prepared for. "I'm Piper," the girl said, looking up, her eyes bright and clear enough that Carrie felt seen through every layer of defense. "Dad said you made him wake up." "Thank you." Carrie swallowed hard, smiled gently, and smoothed a loose curl away from the child's face. "I'm really glad your dad is okay," she said, and her voice sounded strangely natural. Piper shook her head like someone who understood grown-up things. "No, you made my dad come back," she said, then tugged at Carrie's hand, as if tugging at a secret. "I want to show you my dinosaur room." Mason watched them, something shifting in his gaze, quick as light crossing water, and Carrie realized that for 1 second, this man wasn't the kingpin of a city. He was only a father watching his child cling to a stranger. Piper pulled Carrie down the hall, talking nonstop about brave dinosaurs and drawings she'd made, and Carrie listened and breathed, because a child's voice made this house less frightening, but also sadder in a way she couldn't name, as if laughter were a rare thing permitted to exist here. When they passed a thick wooden door with a lock, Piper slowed and then pulled Carrie faster, as if she'd been reminded to avoid it. Carrie glanced back and saw that door was different from the others. No ordinary handle, a severe lock, and on the wood a small scratch like a fingernail mark. Piper didn't explain. She only mumbled, "Don't go in there," and kept pulling. Carrie didn't ask, but her heart tightened, because she understood it was the door of a pain kept sealed. They reached the playroom, toys arranged neatly, books lined up, everything cared for by a careful hand, and while Piper lined her dinosaurs up in a row, Mason stood in the doorway watching Carrie as if measuring whether she knew how to hold a boundary. Carrie played with Piper for a while, laughed at the child's innocent stories, and for the first time in days she felt part of her body stop bracing. When Piper ran off to fetch a new drawing, Carrie stepped back toward the living room, and in that exact moment her phone vibrated, not the backup device, but her personal number. Marlene had returned to her this morning with the reminder, "Only use it when necessary." The screen showed an unfamiliar number, and when Carrie answered, a polite woman's voice asked to confirm whether Carrie was the authorized person to pick Piper up next week, because the school system had just received an update listing a substitute pickup person under the name Carrie Whitaker. A terrifying realization washed over her. When Paige had borrowed her badge under the pretense of a printer error, she hadn't just copied the security token. She had used that window to access Carrie's private personnel file, harvesting her personal cell number to link her directly to the school's compromised system. "No," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "That isn't me. I'm not involved. I've never registered." The voice apologized, said it might be a data entry mistake, but asked again to be certain, and Carrie answered firmly and ended the call, her palms slick with cold sweat. Mason had seen the change in her face. He came closer, not circling, not softening, and asked only the direct question. "Who called?" Carrie handed him the phone, repeated every word, and she watched Mason's jaw tighten, his eyes darkening as if something old had been dragged back to the surface. "A substitute pickup," he repeated, voice low. "Under your name." Carrie nodded, her throat burning dry. "I didn't do it." Mason studied her for a few seconds, as if deciding whether the panic in her eyes was real, then turned and called for Rafe with a short command. "Check it now," he said. "The school's pickup list, the camera contractor, every recent change, and I want to know who touched the system." Rafe nodded, pulled out his phone, and made calls, his face colder than usual. Piper ran out of the playroom, holding a drawing with 3 figures, one tiny in the middle and 2 larger ones on either side, the colors messy but full of confidence. And she announced happily that this was home. And Carrie looked at the picture and felt both warmth and a chill, because while the child called it home, an invisible hand had just tried to reach the door of that home from the outside, by tapping on her name. Carrie left the estate, with Piper's drawing pressed into her hand, and a weight like stone sitting in her stomach, because the warmth of a child's hug had barely had time to bloom before it was crushed by that wrong number call that smelled like it had been arranged. And even though Mason had ordered Rafe to investigate, she couldn't shake the thought that someone was testing doors, not the door to her rented room anymore, but the door into a child's life. On Monday morning, she walked into Northmark with eyes that were sharper, more careful, and also lonelier, because everything she knew now couldn't be said to anyone, while the people around her only knew a simpler version. A version simple enough to sneer at. From the lobby, Carrie could already hear the whispers like a thin layer of smoke threading through the air, dying when she passed, rising again when she moved on. And even if she couldn't catch every sentence, she could hear the fragments that fell like knives. She climbed up on CPR. She saved the boss to take a seat. Who gets to the penthouse like that? Followed by a small laugh like a final period. Carrie walked straight ahead and didn't turn, but every word cut, because she'd lived poor long enough to know people didn't forgive someone else for getting a rare chance, even when that chance was born out of a moment near death. The moment she sat down, a notification arrived from IT stating that her access to certain operations folders would be adjusted per internal request. The reason written in a single dry phrase, access review, and when she tried to open the folder she'd viewed the week before, the screen told her she didn't have permission. She stared at that line longer than she needed to, feeling as if someone had just tightened the space she was allowed to breathe in. And she understood this was another way of teaching her her place, more refined than the muzzle of a gun. Julia called her over, her tone still professional but her eyes oddly distant, and said that during a sensitive period, Carrie should only handle tasks assigned to her directly and avoid touching things that weren't necessary, then paused for a beat as if she wanted to add more but didn't. Carrie nodded and didn't argue, because she knew arguing now would only earn her another invisible note in an invisible file. Back at her desk, she tried to focus on the work in front of her, but every message, every email, every look seemed to carry a second meaning, as if everyone were measuring where she might trip. That was when Paige came over with a cup of water and a smile soft as cotton, the kind of softness that makes you want to drop your guard. Paige was a young communications assistant, petite, light-haired, a voice that always sounded like she was apologizing for existing, and she sat on the corner of Carrie's desk without asking, speaking quietly like she was sharing a secret. "Are you okay?" Paige asked, eyes wide with sympathy. "I heard people saying stupid things. They're just jealous." Carrie looked at Paige and didn't know whether to trust her or watch her, but she thanked her anyway, because at least someone was pretending to be kind. Paige sighed, as if she felt it with her. "I hate this place sometimes," she said. "If you don't have anyone to talk to, you can talk to me." Carrie was about to refuse gently, because she didn't want to drag anyone in. But Paige continued, her voice dropping lower. "Actually," Paige said, "I think you should do something that makes them shut up. Prove yourself. Do you want to?" Carrie's brow tightened just slightly. "Prove myself how?" Paige glanced around like she was afraid of being overheard, then slid a small note onto the desk. Just a list of a few documents to review, a few internal emails to compile for a high-level operations meeting. "This is hard work," Paige said, eyes shining as if she were handing over an opportunity. "If you can do it, people will have to respect you. Especially operations. They're picky. I can help you get temporary access, because I still have a secondary permission." Carrie looked at the note and felt an alarm flare in her mind like a fire siren, not because of the tasks, but because the offer to help her get access sounded too much like a door opening in the wrong direction. And then the images came back. The broken window, the threatening message, the wrong number call about Piper's school, the warning whispered in the elevator, pushing her into a corner, because if she kept stepping back, she would always be seen as the girl who climbed up on luck. But if she stepped forward, she might step straight into a trap. "Let me look at it first," Carrie said, her tone neutral, neither accepting nor refusing, and Paige nodded as if she understood, but her eyes flashed with something so quick Carrie wasn't sure she'd actually seen it. At that exact moment, Carrie's personal phone vibrated, a voice note notification from a contact saved as Piper, with a childlike heart icon beside it. Carrie opened it but didn't play it, only stared at the short length of the message, and her chest tightened as she remembered the hug at the estate, the drawing of 3 figures, the word home Piper had used, and the call that had tried to turn Carrie into the substitute pickup. Carrie didn't dare press play in an office full of eyes, and she didn't dare reply right away either, because she was afraid that even a single word she sent could be turned into evidence for something she didn't yet understand. She locked the screen, set the phone face down, and in that forced silence, Carrie realized the whispers weren't just gossip. They were knives sharpened with steady care, slicing at her reputation while also steering her toward the direction someone else wanted. Piper's voice note sat on Carrie's screen like a piece of candy wrapped in steel. And Carrie looked at it again and again throughout the day but still didn't dare listen, because every time she lifted her phone, she felt eyes watching from behind, not the curious eyes of coworkers, but the eyes of a system that knew how to turn every intimate thing into evidence. Paige still drifted by now and then, checking on her, sliding a few more tasks her way, always with that gentle line that Carrie only had to prove herself once and then everything would settle, and the more Carrie heard it, the more she felt like she was standing at the edge of a pit covered in dry leaves. By Tuesday, the pit opened for real, not with noise, not with police bursting in, but with a single email from compliance, the subject line cold, instructing her to report to an internal meeting room that afternoon to clarify an issue related to leaked documents. Carrie read it twice, 3 times, her heart racing, then looked around the office and saw that a few people had already started glancing toward her as if they could smell blood before it spilled. When she stood and followed the compliance staff member down the hallway, the whispers flared up behind her like fire catching wind, and this time she heard them more clearly, saying the exact thing she feared most, that the new girl had to be shady, that if you climbed up on CPR, you came back down on a scandal. The compliance meeting room was on a lower floor, frosted glass on the door, white light inside that felt clinical, and on the table a laptop had been set out beside printed system logs, looking like a death certificate for a reputation. Julia was there, no longer wearing her usual busy composure, only irritation mixed with unease. The look of someone dragged into an investigation who didn't want to stand on either side. 2 compliance employees sat across from Carrie, their voices procedural, not directly threatening, yet every word felt like a cuff closing. "We're investigating the leak of sensitive documents related to operations, strategy, and media response," the first one said. "System access records indicate your account opened and exported data during that window." Carrie felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not possible," she said, holding her voice together by force. "I didn't export anything. I was even restricted from those folders." The second person flipped through the printouts and pointed to a timestamp line, saying the system recorded access using her credentials from an internal address in the building. Carrie stared at the line until her eyes ached, because it looked like truth and it was the perfect trap. Someone had used her own name to open the door. "It could be a system error," she said, "or someone used my account." "Did you share your password?" the first one asked, tone even. "No," Carrie answered immediately. "Never." "Did you lend your badge to anyone?" they asked next. Carrie thought of Paige's offer about temporary access, and the way Paige hovered around the hard assignments. But Carrie didn't dare throw a name into a room like this without proof, because here, if she named the wrong person even once, she'd be seen as trying to push blame. "No," she said, but this time her voice held a hair less certainty, just enough to make Julia's brow tighten. The second compliance employee slid a notice toward her and said that per procedure, her access would be temporarily locked during the investigation. She would still report to work, but couldn't touch confidential documents, couldn't send external email to certain groups, and personal devices could be reviewed if necessary. Carrie felt as if the ground beneath her had turned to ice. "Am I suspended?" she asked. "No," the first one replied, "but you're under review." Those 2 words were enough to hang a person in the eyes of a crowd. When Carrie stepped out of the meeting room, the hallway felt longer than usual, and the whispers behind the frosted glass sounded like knives being sharpened. "She's being investigated. I knew it. She's protected. There's always something with that type." Carrie returned to her desk and tried to open email, tried to open folders. Everything came back with access denied, and the sense of being locked out wasn't only about data, it was about breath. She looked up toward the elevator that led to the penthouse, where the most powerful man in the building could end it all with a single call. And in that moment, a part of her wanted to beg, wanted to scream that she'd been set up, that someone was trying to turn her into a sacrifice. But then she saw the eyes around her, saw Julia's silence, remembered Marlene's words about being silent the right way, and she understood that if Mason intervened publicly, every whisper would harden into a verdict, that she would be stamped forever as someone who climbed by favor, not by truth. And what hurt most was that Mason didn't text, didn't call, as if he'd vanished at the exact moment she needed a word, even a single one. Carrie picked up her phone and looked at Piper's unheard voice note, looked at Mason's number saved for work contact, and for the first time her heart reacted like a wound, angry and aching at once, because being left alone didn't feel any different from being pushed back to where she'd started, isolated and not believed. She drew a breath, turned off the screen, then did the thing she knew would hurt more than being investigated. She shut every door that led to them. She didn't listen to Piper's voice note. She didn't reply to any messages. She didn't reach for Mason first, as if she were cutting with her own hands the rare, warm thread that had connected her to that silent house, because if this world wanted to turn her into a dirty story, she would prove she was clean by standing alone, even if she had to stand in the cold. The next day, Carrie arrived earlier than usual. Not to prove anything to the people waiting to watch her fall, but to give herself a few quiet hours before the whispers started rubbing at her ears like sand. She worked within the limits of her locked access, replying to harmless emails, polishing paragraphs that didn't touch anything sensitive, then staring at the little padlock icon beside folders she used to be able to open, feeling as if she were looking at a door sealed shut with thick tape. She didn't text Mason. She didn't listen to Piper's voice note, and she certainly didn't tell anyone that every time she saw that padlock, she thought of the unmarked door on the 12th floor and the dry, cold click from that night. By late afternoon, the office thinned out, ceiling lights going dark zone by zone, the sound of typing growing sparse like late-season rain, and Carrie realized that if she wanted to survive this witch hunt, she couldn't wait for anyone to rescue her. She had to flip the trap herself. She stayed, pretending to finish her work, waiting until Julia left, waiting until Paige stood up and waved goodbye with a smile sweet as sugar and disappeared into the elevator, waiting until the hallway held only the hush of air conditioning. When it was late enough, Carrie pulled out her company laptop, reopened the compliance emails and notices, and read every line the way you read a case file, then began the only thing she could do, follow the trail without full permissions, because she still had the ability to read and reason. She remembered exactly what they'd said, that the access trace came from an internal building address. And she remembered something else, too, that systems always left crumbs in places people didn't think to look, in automated emails, in copied attachments, in forgotten links. Carrie dug through her inbox for old IT alerts, access update notices, meeting minutes that contained links to document repositories. And finally, she found an internal email sent to the communications group last week, one that included a shortened log excerpt attached as an example of leak risk. It wasn't complete, but it was enough for her to see a strange string of characters at the end, a note about access location, and a device code. She captured it, then compared it to earlier system error notices she'd seen, lined up dates and times, and little by little a scattered picture began to snap into place. The access event assigned to her account happened after business hours, at a time she knew she was home, because that night she had been sitting with her knees drawn up by the plastic-covered window, listening to wind slap against the sheet. But the system recorded a signal from a different internal network, not from her floor, but from a cluster of devices labeled Off-Site Warehouse, the place Northmark stored freight temporarily before transfers. Carrie stared at that label for a long time, because she'd seen Off-Site Warehouse appear in those strange logistics documents, and in a few internal discussions a new hire wasn't supposed to hear. She didn't have permission to dig deeper, but she could still use what she had left, the fragments of time. She opened an old calendar view, pulled it back to the day Mason had been drugged, the day she'd saved him, then looked at the timestamp on the log excerpt, and the blood in her body went cold when she recognized a coincidence too clean to be called coincidence. During the window when Mason collapsed in that locked room, the hallway camera system on that floor had gone down for exactly 9 minutes, and those 9 minutes matched a blank space in the log she was staring at, a blank marked as system maintenance. 9 minutes wasn't long if you were waiting for an elevator, but it was long enough to lock a door, kill a camera, slip drugs into water, and walk away without leaving a face behind. Cold sweat gathered at the back of Carrie's neck, because suddenly the investigation into leaked documents wasn't just office politics anymore. It carried the same scent as the failed assassination, the same camera blackout, the same use of the system as an invisible blade. She forced herself to stay calm, wrote down what she'd found on paper: off-site warehouse, different internal network, 9-minute camera outage, and then a small detail flared like a spark: badge token. In an old IT guide she'd just unearthed, there was a note that the company access system used the door badge token synchronized with login credentials, and if the token was copied, someone could open doors and log in as the badge owner for a limited period before the system flagged anomalies. Carrie read that line and felt her heart tighten as if someone had squeezed it, because she remembered the day Paige first sat beside her desk, offering sympathy in the middle of whispers. And there had been a moment when Paige smiled, an apologetic smile, and said her badge wouldn't scan at the print room. Could she borrow Carrie's badge for 1 minute? Just 1 minute. Would Carrie help her? Carrie had handed it over then, because it was the reflex of someone who'd learned to help others in exchange for quiet, and because 1 minute sounded harmless. Now that minute rose in her mind, like a door left cracked open for someone else to slip through. Paige was also the first to talk about proving herself, the first to offer help with temporary access, the first to defend her in public while nudging her closer to the padlock. Carrie sat perfectly still, staring at the screen as it blurred because her eyes burned, not from sadness, but from the terrifying clarity of a trap woven out of sweetness. She couldn't declare it yet, but she had enough to believe someone had copied her badge token, used it to open doors she never opened, then hung the leak on her neck like a collar. And if she didn't pull that collar off with evidence, she would die another way, not in body, but as a name erased from every opportunity, disappearing among the people who liked watching others disappear for opening the wrong door. Carrie left the building that night with a thin stack of notes in her bag and a tension as thick as fog, because the more she threaded the pieces together, the more clearly she could see she wasn't facing a simple office scapegoating game at all. She was standing in front of something much larger, and that structure had teeth. She didn't text anyone, only promised herself that tomorrow morning she'd submit the traces she'd found to compliance in the smartest way she could. But life in this place didn't wait for her to arrange it. It stopped her the moment she stepped out onto the ground floor. The revolving glass door had barely sealed behind her. Cold wind slapped her face, and a woman stood across the street as if she'd been there a long time. Dark coat, hair tied back, posture straight, eyes that didn't dodge. She wasn't in uniform, she didn't wear a badge, but she had the kind of look that belonged to someone who'd seen dead bodies more often on paper than on a floor. "Caroline Whitaker," she said, her voice firm and flat. She didn't wait for an introduction. Her eyes had the cold weight of someone who had been watching from the shadows for a long time. "We've been tracking the Northmark leaks for months," Leah said. "No detour. Our task force has been monitoring the building perimeter and every digital breadcrumb since the first breach. You aren't our target. Caroline, you're the witness we've been waiting for to finally draw Declan out of the dark. And closer to Declan Voss than you think." Carrie's throat dried out. "I'm not close to anyone," she said. Leah nodded, as if accepting a self-protective lie. "I don't care what you call it. I care that you're standing in the line of fire." Leah opened a thin folder and showed Carrie a few grainy copies. Shipping schedules, cargo codes, route lines, all of it looking like logistics on the surface, except for the blacked-out sections and the handwritten notes. "Declan Voss isn't just playing internal games. He's tied to a human trafficking network," Leah said, her voice not shaking on those words, as if she'd said them too many times to still feel the nausea. Carrie felt her stomach turn. "What are you saying?" she blurted, and instantly hated herself for letting emotion slip out. Leah looked straight at her and didn't give her anywhere to hide. "Human trafficking. Not a rumor. The task force is on it. We need evidence thick enough to close it. Not a near miss that lets him come back stronger." Carrie stared at the papers, at the route codes, and remembered the strange documents she'd seen in the operations folder. Remembered the off-site warehouse and the 9 minutes of dead cameras. Something filthy rose in her mind, the smell of things hidden under a legal coat. "And what do I have to do with any of this?" Carrie asked, her voice catching. Leah slipped the folder away and lowered her voice like a whisper. "You're the way in. You can hear, you can see, you can touch things other people can't touch without getting shot on sight. You help us, we help you." Carrie clenched her bag strap, cold sweat gathering under her coat. "I'm not an informant," she said. Leah didn't look surprised. "You don't have to call it that," she said. "You just have to live, and help a few other people live." Then Leah said the one thing that made Carrie go ice cold, like a blade laid against the softest part of her. "And Piper." Carrie blinked, not believing she'd heard right. "You know Piper?" Carrie asked, her voice cracking slightly. Leah held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, decisive. "I know you went to the estate. I know the school's pickup list was updated with a substitute pickup under your name. I also know the school cameras just changed contractors, and cases like that are usually the opening move." Carrie felt her insides knot, anger and fear twisting together, because Leah spoke as if Piper were just a line in a file, while to Carrie, she was a rare, warm hug in the cold. "Don't use her to force me," Carrie said, her voice trembling from restraint. Leah didn't apologize. "I'm not forcing you," she said. "I'm reminding you what it costs to look away." Carrie shook her head and stepped back, sickened by how every side wanted to turn her into a tool. "No," she said, clearer this time. "I'll clear my name myself. I won't sell my soul to anyone." Leah watched her, her eyes darkening. Not quite disappointment, more like a cold calculation. "You think you've got a choice?" Leah said. "In this city, your choices are often an illusion." Carrie turned to leave, wanting to move fast. But at that exact moment, a strong hand clamped around her elbow and jerked her back from the curb. Rafe appeared as if he'd stepped out of shadow, his face unchanged, but his eyes pure warning. "Go," he said to Carrie, one word that landed like a protective command. Leah stood across from them and didn't retreat. She only looked at Rafe, then at Carrie, her voice low as if pinning itself to memory. "If you change your mind, you call me. By then, Piper might not have time left for your stubbornness." Rafe pulled Carrie away, her step catching for a beat, and in the wind, she heard her own heart pounding like a drum, because she'd just seen something even more frightening than Declan, a war where both law and crime were willing to use innocent people to win. Rafe didn't ask Carrie whether she wanted to go or not. He simply yanked her away from the curb like he was pulling someone back from the edge of a cliff, shoved her into a black car already waiting in a blind corner, then slammed the door. The sound cutting through the cold wind and cutting off any chance for her to turn and look at Leah one more time. The car surged forward. No horn, no noisy urgency, but fast enough that streetlights stretched into long streaks, and Carrie sat rigid, her hands clamped around her bag as if it could hold the last ordinary piece of her life inside it. Rafe said only one sentence, his voice stripped of emotion. "You've just been put in the sights of both sides." Carrie looked at him, wanting to ask who both sides were, but the question died on her lips, because she could already feel it. Declan, Leah, Compliance, and Mason, each pulling her in a different direction while she wanted nothing more than to stand still. The car turned onto a quieter route, then dropped into a sealed garage, the iron gate shutting behind them like a jaw closing, and Carrie was led through a windowless concrete corridor to a steel room with a coated lock, a place with nothing but a table, a few chairs, a camera in the corner, and a clean, cold smell like a hospital. Safe room, Carrie thought, a phrase that sounded like shelter and felt like a waiting room before a verdict. Rafe made her sit, checked her phone, then returned it without explanation, only telling her she'd stay here until it was safe. And when Carrie asked safe from who, he didn't answer. He only stood in front of the door like a breathing wall. She thought she'd be left there, but less than a few minutes later, footsteps sounded outside. Then the door opened. Mason walked in with two other men, and between them was a man being held by both arms, bruised face, wrinkled shirt, a mouth still trying to smile like someone who believed he had a way out. Carrie sprang to her feet on instinct, her heart hammering as if it meant to break her ribs. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice tight. Mason didn't look at her right away. He went straight to the table and set down a stack of papers, his gaze cold and calm like deep water. "You need to see it," he said, as if he were talking about a report. The man was shoved into the chair across from her, and Carrie understood that truth didn't need gunfire to be terrifying here. It was terrifying because everyone moved as if this were routine. The man glanced at Carrie, then at Mason, his tone half pleading and half defiant. "It's just business, Mason. You know the rules." Mason lifted his eyes, dark and unmoving. "My rule is keeping what's mine alive," he said. "And you sold my roots to someone who wants me dead?" The man gave a dry laugh, trying to claw back control. "I didn't sell you," he said. "I sold information. Everybody does. Declan pays high." The name dropped into the room like a hot piece of metal. Carrie felt her stomach twist, and when she glanced at Rafe, she saw his jaw tighten, his eyes sharp as a blade. Mason didn't say much. He simply opened the stack, flipped through pages, photographs of logs, call records, vehicle schedules, lines of proof heavy enough to expose the lie, and he laid each sheet in front of the man as if placing stones on a coffin. "I don't have time for explanations," Mason said, his voice still low and even. "I only need to know who opened the door, who killed the camera, who put that into my glass." The man stiffened for a beat, his eyes darting, then his voice dropped, turned dirty. "I was following orders," he said. "I didn't think he'd touch the kid." Mason stared straight at him, and for the first time his anger showed not as shouting, but as a sudden stillness, like the air being pulled out of the room. "What you thought," Mason said quietly, "won't save you." He gave a small signal, and everything happened so fast that Carrie understood it by sensation more than sight. One man locked the suspect's shoulder. Rafe stepped in and held his head. Mason didn't raise a gun to a forehead or bark threats. He only took something small and cold shining from his pocket, pressed it to the man's wrist, and in one clean motion, a breath burst out. The man jerked hard and then went slack, like a switch had been turned off. No spray of blood, no explosion, only a crushing silence settling over the room and the soft scrape of a chair against the floor. Carrie stumbled backward until her spine hit the wall, eyes wide, hands shaking with shock, because she had just watched a life get taken as quickly as a light being turned out. And the most horrifying thing was that Mason didn't tremble. He looked at the body the way you look at a problem already solved, then finally turned to Carrie, his face offering no apology. "You just killed someone," Carrie blurted, her voice breaking, anger and fear and disgust crashing together, like the last of her faith had been snapped in half. Mason stepped one pace closer, not touching her, but the pressure of him made her lift her chin. "I keep Piper alive," he said, each word falling like unyielding flint. You want clean morality. I wanted that too. But clean morality doesn't stop a rock from coming through your window. It doesn't stop someone from putting your name on a pickup list for my child. Carrie breathed in raggedly, tears rising from fury and helplessness. So what am I in this? She asked. A clean coat you wear over your violence. Mason held her gaze for a long moment, then said flatly, You're the person who walked in at the exact moment. And because of that, you're in the game. Carrie shook her head hard, her voice turning rigid even as her lips trembled. No, she said. I'm going to clear my name. I'm going to bring down this leak trap with evidence. And the moment I'm clean, I quit. I won't work for this world. I won't let Piper learn that killing is how you stay safe. Mason didn't argue right away. He only looked at her like she was standing on the threshold of herself, then turned away and signaled for the cleanup, and everything slid back into its terrifying order. Carrie stood there, cold from bone to skin, understanding the break had completed itself, not because she'd run out of feeling, but because she'd just seen what was most real in Mason, and that reality didn't allow her to keep pretending that between them it was only a story of saving a life and being thanked. Carrie walked out of the safe room with her hands still cold as if they'd touched metal, and the promise to quit the moment she cleared her name, hammering in her head like a nail. But she knew that if she wanted out, she had to pull the leak collar off her own throat first. She had to turn suspicion into proof in a way compliance couldn't ignore, and Mason couldn't save her from. She didn't trust soft comfort anymore. She didn't trust innocent instinct anymore. She trusted traces, the kind of thing you could put on a table so no one could argue with it. What she'd threaded together the night before was enough to suggest a copied token, and a hand that knew how to kill cameras at the right moment. But to name someone in a system like this, she needed them to reveal themselves, to bite the bait with their own teeth. Carrie asked Julia for a small task, the reason perfectly reasonable, that she wanted to draft an internal response for the rumor and leak situation to reduce panic. And Julia agreed because she was drowning. Carrie wrote the draft carefully, every sentence legal enough, bland enough not to draw attention. Then she embedded an invisible watermark, not a giant name across the page, but a short string hidden in the metadata, and a single intentional misspelling in one line only, something only her version would carry. She named the file in a normal way, then sent it to one person only, Paige, with a light message that she wanted Paige to review it and give notes, because Paige understood the internal tone, and Carrie forced herself to write as if she still trusted Paige. Paige replied fast, with a cute emoji, and the same sugar-sweet line as always. Don't worry, I'll look right now. I'll help you prove to them you deserve it. The words raised goosebumps along Carrie's spine, because they sounded exactly like the way Paige had walked her toward the padlock, exactly like the way Paige had defended her in front of the whispers, exactly like the way Paige had softened her into handing over her badge for just 1 minute. Carrie counted time like she'd count a pulse, set her phone face down, and waited. Less than an hour later, the backup device vibrated. No threat message this time, only an internal alert Carrie had configured to ping if that file was accessed outside an allowed scope. The warning appeared. The document had just been opened from a device not on the office network, and in that moment Carrie knew the bait had been bitten. She kept her face calm and stood to get water like she did every day. But inside her chest something roared under tight control, pain at betrayal braided with a cold clarity that the truth was arriving exactly the way she feared. By the end of the day, a finance news page posted a coy piece about Northmark's internal situation, written like journalism but structured like a black market, quoting several lines from Carrie's draft with precision. And most importantly, it carried the exact misspelling she'd planted, like a fingerprint pressed into evidence. Carrie took screenshots, saved everything, then quietly sent the evidence packet to Marlene through an internal channel. Only screenshots, access alert timestamps, and the metadata watermark code. No emotion, no accusation, only data. She knew Marlene would understand immediately, because this was the only language the system listened to. That night, Paige drifted by Carrie's desk again, wearing a sympathetic face, whispering that Carrie shouldn't be upset. They'd find the culprit. She only needed patience. And the way Paige looked at her in that moment let Carrie see something else under the sugar, jealousy glinting like a shard of glass. Paige didn't envy Carrie's salary. Paige envied the fact that Carrie had been seen, summoned to the penthouse, hugged by a child, the household treated like a treasure. Spoken of in meetings, Paige could only hover outside. Paige wanted that. Paige wanted to become someone important in the story of a kingpin. But Paige was only the water runner, the note-taker, the face no one remembered. Carrie understood it when Paige added a line that sounded casual. "You're so lucky. One time saving someone and your whole life changes." And Paige's eyes didn't smile with her mouth. Late that night, Marlene called Carrie down to a small conference room, and this time there was no smooth procedural voice, only the sharpness of someone who'd peeled back a layer of skin. On the table were printed access strings, the forwarded link trail Paige had used, and the destination address, not any legitimate newsroom, but a mailbox under the cover of a market analytics company, a perfect front to collect documents and sell them to rivals. And worse, it tied into the same off-site warehouse network Carrie had seen in the logs, the thing Leah had named with the dirtiest word, human trafficking. Paige was brought in, face drained white, eyes red, still trying to hold a broken smile in place. When Marlene set the watermark proof in front of her, Paige collapsed like a spring that had been unlatched, sobbing and then shouting that she didn't want to, that she'd been forced, that Declan had photos, had debt, had people watching her, that if she didn't forward the files they would make her disappear. And then Paige whipped toward Carrie, her voice full of hate and desperation at once. "Why her? Why does she get seen and I don't? I just wanted them to look at me one time." Carrie stood there, feeling the final pieces click into place, and the cold running down her spine wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding that Paige wasn't only greedy. Paige was a blade Declan held by the handle, driven by weakness and jealousy together. And that leak channel had never been journalism at all. It was the mouth of a monster eating information to feed something far bigger than taking down a new hire like Carrie. Carrie didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid of being framed anymore, but because a filthy feeling clung to her skin like smoke, the kind of filth that comes from watching a human being bent into a tool by debt and threats, and from hearing Piper's name dangled like a hook in front of Paige's mouth. The next morning, Carrie arrived at the company carrying a file she'd printed herself, clipped neatly into a plastic binder, containing everything she could turn into truth no one could argue with. Screenshots of the post that carried her, planted misspelling, the timestamp of the off-network access alert, the metadata watermark code, the forwarding chain, and one final piece Marlene had provided in the night, a secondary hallway camera near the meeting room area, an imperfect angle but enough to capture Paige standing by the printer, bending to work on a device, then pulling out her phone to photograph a screen, and in one passing frame, Carrie's access badge lay on the table like something borrowed for too long. Carrie walked through the lobby as if she were crossing a minefield, eyes still following her, whispers still hissing. But this time she didn't feel small, because she was carrying the one thing that made people go quiet, data. The compliance room was again white light and expressionless faces. But when Carrie set the binder on the table, she didn't apologize, she didn't plead, she simply stated clearly that her account had been abused through a copied badge token, that the documents had been leaked through a front channel that wasn't journalism, and that she had identifying proof of the forwarded draft through the watermark. The two compliance staffers turned page after page, and their expressions shifted from suspicion to tension, because this wasn't a story anymore. It was a chain of numbers locked together like links. Julia sat beside her, face paling, like she'd just realized she'd watched someone get bitten and done nothing. Marlene appeared in the doorway and walked in without introduction, set another packet down, secondary camera logs, access codes, cross-references to the off-site warehouse network, and said in a voice cold as steel that the data showed the leak was deliberate, coordinated, and needed to be handled immediately before it spread. Carrie looked at Marlene, then at compliance, feeling as if she were standing in front of a door she wasn't asking anyone to open this time. She was opening it herself with facts. Paige was called in, exhausted, eyes swollen, and when she saw the binder in front of Carrie, her whole body seemed to sag. "I didn't want to," Paige stammered, voice small. Carrie said nothing, because she knew that if she spoke now, emotion would be used to blur the data, and she wouldn't allow that. Compliance asked Paige a few questions. Paige tried to deny it, and then when they put the secondary camera clip on the screen and highlighted the watermark, Paige broke down like someone being strangled. "I was forced," she screamed, hands shaking uncontrollably. "I was threatened. I owe money. I'm stupid." Marlene didn't soften. She asked one question sharp enough to cut through every detour. "Who forced you?" Paige went silent and bit her lip until it bled. At that moment, the conference room door opened and the air changed instantly, the way it changes when an animal steps into a pen. Mason appeared. No noise, no display, just the shape of him in the doorway making every chair in the room feel harder. Carrie felt a stab in her chest, not from longing, but from anger, because this was the man she'd cut off to stand on her own. And yet he could still appear whenever he wanted, like a kind of fate. Mason didn't look at Carrie for long, only gave a small nod like confirmation that she was here, then turned to compliance. His voice calm and cold, not begging, not issuing an explicit threat, only pressing with the weight of reality. "Look at the data," he said. "Don't look at rumors. Don't look at feelings. Data." One of the compliance people started to mention procedure, but Mason set the cross-reference sheet Marlene had brought onto the table, pointed to the match between the off-site warehouse and the leak route, then said one short line like a stamp. "If you ignore this, you're complicit." No one answered right away, because people here were used to dodging trouble, and Mason had just turned it into legal liability. Carrie watched it with a feeling that was both discomfort and relief. Discomfort because he could still exert force. Relief because this time, he wasn't rescuing her with empty power. He was simply making them look at what she had dragged out of the dark with her own hands. Compliance signaled for security, and Paige was pulled to her feet, her hands struggling, eyes wild, her sobs breaking into a raw, desperate scream. "I didn't want to hurt you," Paige cried, turning toward Carrie as if clawing for the only person who might still see her as human. "They said if I didn't do it, Piper would." The sentence stopped in the air like a knife dropped, but not yet hitting the floor. And in that moment, Carrie saw Mason's face go dark, and her own throat turn ice cold, because Piper's name had been used as a noose again, and this time it wasn't a vague warning. It was a threat that had been spoken clearly enough to make someone betray. Carrie stood as if she'd been nailed in place when Paige's sentence snapped off midair, because Piper's name was no longer a hovering fear. It was a bargaining chip, a target with a price. And in that glass-cold compliance room, she felt, for the first time, that truth didn't bring relief. It brought something heavier, the truth that they'd actually reached the little girl. Paige was dragged out, her crying fading down the hallway, while Carrie kept staring at the door that had just shut as if it held an answer, and Mason didn't speak. He only stood still for a beat, long enough for everyone to understand. This had crossed the line from corporate scandal into something else entirely. Then he turned and moved first, looking at no one, as if he were walking straight into a storm he'd smelled coming for a long time. Carrie wanted to call after him, wanted to ask where Piper was, but she swallowed the words, because fear, right now, felt like noise that gave away your position, and she refused to become noise. Before she could even leave the room, Marlene's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression unchanged but her eyes darkening, then handed the device to Rafe, who stood outside the door like a shadow on guard. Rafe listened to a single line, his jaw locking, his hand gripping the phone as if he could snap it in half. "School," he said. One word, and the air in the room thickened. Mason spun back, and this time the calm of deep water looked sliced open. "Speak," he ordered. Rafe swallowed, his voice still trying to stay level but cracked at the edge. "Report from Piper's school. This afternoon the camera system glitched right at dismissal. They're calling it a contractor issue. There was a brief blackout. The back gate near the playground opened abnormally, and Piper isn't in the pickup line." Carrie felt ice flood her body, because every detail had been circling them like prophecy. The camera contractor change, the substitute pickup list, and now there was no question mark. Only a straight line leading to absence. Mason didn't waste a word. He walked out as if his movement was an order in itself, and Compliance and Julia froze like statues that had just realized they'd been running procedures on top of a bomb. Carrie lunged after him, her heart going wild, and every promise she'd made to cut contact with Piper turned into a slice in her throat. She remembered the unheard voice note, the drawing labeled home, the hug that had felt familiar, and now that picture was being ripped away by a simple fact. Piper was gone. The building's long corridors had never felt so far. The private elevator opened. Mason stepped in. Rafe followed, and Carrie stepped in too without asking, because she knew if she stayed behind she'd suffocate on guilt. Mason flicked his eyes at her for a fraction of a second. He didn't push her out, didn't invite her in. He simply accepted her, the way you accept a wound that's already attached itself to you. The elevator moved, but Mason didn't go to the penthouse. He ordered a change of direction. The car was already waiting, the team already gathering, his voice short and sharp as cut steel. And in that moment, Carrie saw the most frightening kind of power. Wasn't guns or money, it was speed. The speed of a man so familiar with loss that every reaction had become survival instinct. When they reached the estate, the house that had always felt controlled and quiet now seemed hollowed out, toys still placed where they belonged, Piper's small jacket still hanging on its hook, but the sound of running feet and laughter was gone, leaving behind a cold, biting emptiness. Rafe spread out a school map, had people checking gate logs. Mason called the head of security directly, and he didn't roar, but every word carried pressure heavy enough to make the voice on the other end shake. Carrie stood beside them, watching men in black move like a formation, and in her mind, there was only one sentence. This wasn't a child wandering off. This was a taking, planned and clean. Mason's phone buzzed. The screen showed an unfamiliar number, and the entire room seemed to stop breathing as he opened it. It wasn't a call. It was a message with an image. Carrie saw it before she could turn away. Piper strapped to a chair, tape over her mouth, eyes red and wet but wide open, and behind her a cold metal wall, fluorescent light bleaching her skin into something pale and fragile. Carrie's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth on instinct, while Mason stood utterly still in a way that was terrifying, as if one hard breath would make the world explode. Beneath the photo, a line of text appeared. Short, cold, sharpened like a blade, just honed. Trade the CPR girl for the kid. Carrie felt the blood drain out of her body. Because there was no guessing now. Declan had pulled her out of shadow and set her on a negotiation table, and the hit landed exactly where Mason was weakest, exactly where she was softest, and exactly where every quiet foreshadowing had been leading. A camera blackout at the perfect moment, a back gate opening when it shouldn't, a child disappearing, and the price of life written in one name, Carrie. Declan's message hung in the estate's living room like an iron hook, unspoken but audible all the same, and Carrie stood there feeling as if her chest had been hollowed out by a kind of guilt that made no sense and still stuck like glue. If only she'd listened to Piper's voice note. If only she hadn't blocked the child. If only she'd been sharper sooner about that substitute pickup. If only she'd never opened that door in the first place. But she wouldn't let herself collapse, because collapse was a luxury for people who didn't have a child taped silent in a photograph. Carrie drew a deep breath, forced the panic back behind her ribs, then stepped to the table where Rafe was spreading route maps and the security team was firing off calls like flares. "Give me the exact timeline," she said, her voice rough but clear, and a few heads turned as if they'd suddenly remembered she wasn't just the CPR girl, she was someone who could turn chaos into a straight line. Rafe answered fast. Dismissal in the middle of the afternoon. Camera failure for a brief window right before students reached the gates. The back gate opened during that window and then closed. The teacher assigned to the pickup line didn't see Piper come through the main exit. Carrie took a pen and wrote the times down, then immediately asked about Piper's routine, which gate she was usually picked up at, whether she had any after-school enrichment, whether there were stopping points on her path from classroom to gate, whether anyone often hovered near her. Mason watched her, eyes dark, but he let her speak, because he was fighting not to become a storm. Carrie requested a list of service vehicles with authorized entry under the camera maintenance schedule, along with any regular delivery vendors, because if the cameras failed at the perfect moment, someone needed a reason to be close to the system, and the most believable reason was always maintenance or deliveries. Rafe immediately called for the data, and Carrie turned to Marlene and asked for temporary access to operations reports tied to the camera contractor and the off-site warehouse, because she remembered the leak trail had pointed there. Marlene held Carrie's gaze for a beat, then nodded without questions, as if she understood that procedure wasn't going to save a child. Carrie opened her laptop and built a rough timeline. The camera blackout, the back gate opening, vehicle entries recorded by badge scans, then layered a second map on top, traffic cameras near the school and the primary intersections. Because an abduction couldn't vanish instantly, it had to move through roads. She didn't have direct access to city cameras, but Northmark had logistics service contracts tied to multiple routes, and that meant vehicle location data and area entry logs existed, and Carrie knew how to dig for them with the right keywords. She had Rafe's team pull unusual vehicles that idled near the back gate during that window, especially small box trucks, white vans, or service vehicles bearing contractor logos, because kidnappers loved to dress like normal. As the data came in, Carrie didn't look at license plates first. She looked at behavior. Which vehicle stopped in the blind spot? Which one used hazard lights just long enough to look legitimate? Which one left and didn't return? She circled a cluster sharing the same pattern, heading out of the school zone and turning toward the outskirts, where cold storage units and empty warehouses sat in long rows, exactly the kind of place you could hide a child without neighbors hearing crying. Off-site warehouse, Carrie murmured, and Mason's head snapped toward her like a string had been pulled. Carrie pointed to the screen, showing a service vehicle whose route matched a receiving run tied to the off-site warehouse label she'd seen in the logs. Then she overlaid gate data from an industrial park security checkpoint. A badge scan opening a side gate recorded shortly after the school reported camera loss. They didn't take her far right away, Carrie said, her voice firming as the pieces locked themselves together. They needed a transfer point. Somewhere with metal walls and fluorescent lights, like the photo. Rafe nodded and started calling reconnaissance teams, while Mason stepped closer, staring at the highlighted zone, his eyes cold as stone about to crack. "I'm going," he said, blunt, and Carrie heard the meaning underneath. He would go alone, fast, violent if he had to, because that was how he survived. Carrie moved half a step into his path, not touching him, but enough that he had to look at her. "No," she said, low and steady. "You want guns to solve it, but I read traces better than guns." Mason studied her, weighing whether she was asking to come because she was brave, or because she wanted to die. Carrie swallowed hard and didn't look away. "Declan's using me to pull you out of control," she said. "If you rush in blind, you'll land in the trap he built. Let me come with you. I don't shoot well, but I see what men with guns miss." Rafe stood beside them, silent, but his eyes looked like agreement, because he knew every foreshadowing had turned real. The cameras, the back gate, the off-site warehouse, and what they needed now wasn't only force, it was a mind that didn't shake. Mason held the silence for a long time, then finally nodded once. Not full consent, but acceptance of the reality that this war had put Carrie's name on the table the moment Declan sent that photo, and if they wanted Piper back, they had to enter it with both brain and gun, not rage alone. The car tore through dark, sparse suburban roads like a bad promise. Carrie wedged in the middle seat with her eyes fixed on the route map she'd just built herself, her heart pounding hard while her mind stayed strangely clear. As if once you stepped into war, your body understood that panic was a luxury. Mason sat up front in silence, both hands resting on his knees like he was holding an animal down inside his own ribs. Rafe in the passenger seat feeding updates into his earpiece, the men in black following behind in formation without headlights, leaving only the sound of tires grinding on wet asphalt. When the industrial park came into view, low, long warehouses lay still like enormous coffins, and Carrie knew she'd been right about the metal and the fluorescent glare in that photo. This place didn't need neighbors, didn't need pedestrians. It only needed steel doors and the steady breath of refrigeration. They stopped short of the target. Rafe signaled engines off. Everyone slipped out of the vehicles like shadows, and Mason looked at Carrie for one beat, an order in his eyes not to do anything reckless, then turned and led the team forward while Carrie followed without a gun, holding only a small flashlight and the backup phone like a flimsy life raft. The warehouse door was opened with a fast, practiced motion, metal hissing softly, cold air spilling out at once, dampness and preservative chemicals threading through it, the lights inside not fully on, only a few weak bulbs turning everything into smeared gray bands. Rafe split the team in two, signaled silence, and Mason moved straight toward the deep freezer section, where thick insulated doors waited and a compressor hummed like the breathing of a large animal. Carrie stayed close, scanning the floor for a drag mark, a smear, anything out of place, and then she saw a plastic zip tie dropped near the threshold, the kind used to bind wrists. Her throat tightened, but her feet kept moving, and when they reached the freezer door, Mason signaled stop. Rafe checked the lock, and the next seconds happened as fast as a button press. The door swung open, cold slapping Carrie's face, white hard light snapping on. Inside were mostly empty shelves and a few foam coolers, and in the low corner against the wall, Piper was curled up, her mouth free now, but red marks banding her wrists, her lips faintly purple from the cold, her eyes wide with terror, and when she saw Carrie, she made a choking little sound, like a person grabbing for the only name that still meant safety. Carrie rushed in, dropped to her knees, pulled Piper into her chest, pressed both palms to the child's back to give warmth, wrapped her own coat around that small, shaking body, forcing her voice to stay normal even as her eyes burned. I'm here, Carrie whispered, and Piper clung to her neck, trembling like a tiny bird. Mason stood behind them for a beat, his eyes darkening, but he didn't lunge forward, as if the whole room were telling him this wasn't the end yet. Footsteps sounded from the warehouse entrance, slow, deliberate, like someone tapping rhythm before drawing a curtain. And a familiar male voice rose, polite enough to be nauseating. "How touching," Declan said, and his silhouette filled the freezer doorway. Dark coat, a gun in his hand, and the muzzle didn't point at Mason the way any smart predator would. It pointed straight at Carrie. "I told you," Declan went on, his smile thin. "You've got a special use. You make men like Mason lose their minds." Carrie kept Piper tight against her, tried to shield the child with her own body, ice running down her spine, but she didn't step back, because stepping back meant opening space. Mason moved forward half a step, his voice low and dangerous. "Put the gun down, Declan." Declan laughed, his eyes never leaving Carrie. "No," he said. "Today I'm playing a simpler game." He tipped his chin as if granting a cruel option. "Choose. The CPR girl or the kid. One wrong move, one life." Piper hiccuped in sobs, clutching Carrie's shirt, and Carrie heard her own heart slam like it wanted out of her chest. Yet inside that fear, a colder thread of reason surfaced, because she knew Declan hadn't come here just to kill. He'd come to control, and men who loved control loved to talk. Carrie lifted her face to Declan, kept her tone soft, as if she were speaking to a colleague at the cafe, stretching the syllables to buy time for Mason and Rafe to find an angle. "What do you really want?" Carrie asked, forcing each word slow. "If you trade me for Piper, what do you get? You think I'm worth more than the kid." Declan's brow rose, pleased by the calm that shouldn't exist. "You underestimate yourself," he said, sounding almost delighted. "You're what makes everything messy. The kid is just a key." Carrie nodded slightly as if she understood, then continued, still stretching time with her voice. "A key to open what?" she asked. "To move people where?" Declan's laugh came a little bigger, fed by his own confidence. "To move them somewhere cleaner," he said, "somewhere city cameras can't see. Tonight the cargo goes through the Old South Dock, then out of state before morning." Mason stayed stone still, but Carrie saw his jaw tighten, recording every word. Carrie pressed on, her voice trembling just a little, hidden under manufactured curiosity. "Which old dock?" she asked. "Don't tell me the one by the river. It's crowded. You're not that reckless." Declan's mouth curved, smugness flashing in his eyes. "Not that dock," he said. "The cold storage dock abandoned past the iron bridge. That place is only my people." In the instant Declan let it slip, Rafe shifted position just outside the freezer doorway, and Carrie knew she'd pulled the most important thing out of the mouth holding the gun, but she still didn't dare breathe too hard, because the muzzle was still trained on her. Piper was still shaking in her arms, and Mason was still advancing in silence like a storm locked behind a door, waiting for the exact second to break. The air inside the freezer room was tight as a drawn string. Declan's muzzle still trained on Carrie, Piper shaking in her arms, Mason a few steps away like a stone statue about to split. And then, in that exact instant, distant sirens sliced through the compressor's low hum. Not one, but several, and flashing lights swept across the warehouse door seams like lightning. Declan flicked a glance outward, and his smug smile sagged for a beat, because he understood someone had sealed the roads. Rafe didn't look at Carrie. He only shifted his position by inches, like a shadow waiting for an angle, while Carrie kept her voice low and steady, balancing on the cliff edge so Piper wouldn't panic harder. Footsteps thundered closer. Commands shouted from the front of the warehouse, and then the main door burst open, flashlights and tactical beams cutting in, and a woman's voice, cold as steel, rang out with the one name that mattered, Declan Voss. "Drop the weapon. You're surrounded." Leah appeared in the warehouse entrance, dark coat, her gun held low in correct form, an armored team behind her moving tight and clean like machinery. And for a split second, Carrie saw the brutal reality. There were 2 arrests waiting in this warehouse, one meant for Declan, and one meant for Mason. Leah looked into the freezer room, her eyes landing on Piper in Carrie's arms first, then shifting to Mason. And that look made it clear she was calculating the cost of every step. An agent behind Leah started to move toward Mason on instinct, but Leah lifted a hand to stop him. Small motion. Absolute. "Not now," Leah said. Not loud, but enough to make the whole team check themselves. Declan let out a laugh, trying to claw back control, his gun still never leaving Carrie. "See," he said, mocking, "your law is here. Now you gonna shoot through the kid?" Leah didn't answer the bait. She looked straight at Carrie. "You have evidence," Leah said, not asking, as if she already knew. Carrie swallowed, her heart hammering, but she forced herself steady because Piper could hear every shift in tone. "He just said where they're transferring people," Carrie said, careful to enunciate. "The abandoned cold storage dock past the iron bridge. Tonight they move through there, then out of state before morning." Declan's mouth twitched, anger flashing as he realized he'd slipped. Then he snarled as if violence could glue the moment back together. "Shut up!" he hissed, and the muzzle pressed closer toward Carrie. Piper gave a choking sob, little fingers fisting Carrie's shirt, and Carrie angled her body to shield the child while looking at Leah, as if clinging to the last human choice left in the room. Leah never took her eyes off Declan, but she made a decision so fast, Carrie knew it came from someone who'd watched too many people die, because she hesitated a single beat. "Priority is the child and the network," Leah said, flat and final, then snapped to her team. "Lock the perimeter. Block every exit. Call in units to intercept the dock at the coordinates she gave. I want an arrest warrant on Declan for trafficking and kidnapping, right now." The agents answered, radios crackling like live wires. Declan laughed louder, trying to sound relaxed, but his eyes weren't as confident as they'd been a minute earlier. "You think you've got enough," Declan said to Leah. "You think one sentence buries me." Leah stepped one pace farther into the warehouse, holding the distance, her voice unwavering. "Not one sentence," Leah said. "A chain. Camera failure, back gate, off-site warehouse, the front channel, and now a transfer site from your own mouth. You just locked your own cell." Declan glanced at Mason, then at Carrie, weighing blood paths. "And what about your kingpin?" he said, pressing the word. "You not arresting him, or does the law only apply to people you aren't afraid of?" Leah didn't answer directly, but her eyes swept over Mason for a beat. A silent warning that she hadn't forgotten. "I work with truth," Leah said, "and the truth in front of me is a child shaking, and a network still moving. I'm postponing the rest, because I'm not letting her die." Mason didn't smile, didn't thank her. He stood like a wall, and in the moment Declan's attention tilted toward that exchange, Rafe moved like breath, fast and clean, slipping in from the blind corner, locking onto Declan's gun wrist, twisting the barrel away from Carrie in a precise, quiet control. No shots, no blood, just a surgical takedown that broke Declan's leverage. Mason stepped in immediately after, pinned Declan with a short hard drive that forced him down, then ordered cuffs in a voice so cold it held no feeling at all. Declan thrashed and spat curses, but he was held tight. And for the first time, Carrie saw Mason choose to keep him alive with calculation, as if he understood that 1 second over the line would turn Declan into an excuse to drag Piper and Carrie down with him. Leah watched, her eyes still ice, but her hand lowered a fraction when she saw Piper still safe in Carrie's arms. "Get the child out," Leah said, and medical personnel moved in. Carrie hugged Piper one last time, whispered that she wasn't disappearing, then handed her over to someone with a warming blanket. And under the warehouse's cold light, Declan was hauled away to the sound of cuffs locking, his gaze still trying to nail itself into Carrie like a promise of revenge. But this time, he walked inside the circle of law, not the darkness he controlled. When Piper was wrapped in a blanket and taken to the relief vehicle, the sirens faded into the distance, and the cold warehouse returned to the smell of metal and damp air. Only now there was no gun aimed at Carrie's chest, only the hollow after a storm, the hollow where you start hearing your own heartbeat again, and you start hearing the truths you've been dodging. Leah pulled her team away to tighten the net. Declan was cuffed and escorted out, and Mason stayed behind in the warehouse like a shadow that refused to leave, his eyes following the vehicle carrying Piper until it disappeared. Then he turned back to Carrie, and under the cold fluorescent light his face looked a few years older, not from exhaustion, but from nearly losing the one thing that still made him feel human. Carrie stood by the freezer doorway, her coat still open, her arms still remembering the tremble of Piper clinging to her, and as people fanned out to their tasks, she felt the anger she'd been compressing for days rise like a tide. Not loud, but impossible to stop. "You left me alone," she said. No greeting, no softening, her voice rough but sharp. Mason looked at her and didn't cut her off. Carrie took a single step closer, keeping just enough distance not to be swallowed by his presence. You said you'd have my back. You said I stayed alive if I was in your line of sight. But when they accused me of leaking, when they locked my access, when whispers picked me apart like prey, you stayed silent, Carrie said, each word dropping like stone. What do you call that? Strategy? Or your way of making me get used to taking it? Mason's jaw tightened, his eyes dark. But he didn't argue. Carrie gave a thin laugh with no joy in it. I cleared my own name. I set my own bait. I pulled the data myself. I stood in front of compliance while the whole building wanted to watch me fall. You only showed up once, everything was already burned to ash, just to force them to look at the data. You think that's fair? Mason let out a slow breath, like a man unbolting a door he'd kept shut for too long. I thought I was respecting you, he said, low. And for the first time, Carrie heard in it not only power but weariness. I thought if I intervened, they'd say you were mine. I thought stepping back gave you space. Carrie stared at him, eyes stinging, her voice refusing to soften. You call that respect, she said. I call it abandonment. Mason went quiet for a beat, then nodded once, barely, like accepting a sentence. You're right, he said, and it stopped Carrie short because she wasn't used to hearing him admit anything. Mason moved a fraction closer, still not touching, but his gaze lost its edge, lost its ridges. I call it respect, he repeated, quieter now. But the truth is, it was cowardice. I was afraid if I stood beside you, everything I touched would stain you. I was afraid you'd see what I am, and you'd leave before I could hold on to something rare and good. Carrie swallowed hard, and her anger didn't vanish, but it changed color, because beneath the stone, she saw something more human than she'd wanted to believe existed inside a kingpin. You just proved me right, Carrie said, but her voice came out smaller. You always think you have the right to keep. I'm not something for you to keep. Mason met her eyes without flinching. I know, he said, and today I know something else. Without you, Piper wouldn't have come back. Carrie turned her face slightly away, afraid her eyes would give too much away. Don't use Piper to buy me, she said, and this time it was a clear boundary. If I stay, if I keep working at Northmark or move any closer to your world, I need conditions. Mason nodded and didn't interrupt. Carrie spoke slowly, as if signing a contract with her voice. First, I don't get turned into property in your world. Not a decoration, not a pawn, not a name people bargain with. Second, I don't paint blood with pretty words. I'll keep the right kind of silence, but I won't lie so someone can kill. Third, Piper never gets used as a threat again, not by your enemies, and not by you. Mason listened to every word, eyes never leaving her, then nodded once, firm. Done, he said. I swear it. Carrie gave a tiny laugh, not mocking, just a breath slipping free, because for the first time, she heard an oath without a hidden clause tucked underneath. Silence settled between them, the compressor outside the freezer still humming, and suddenly Carrie felt bone-tired, as if she'd been running her whole life. Mason took half a step forward, lifted his hand, then stopped, as if asking permission with a hesitation that didn't belong to him. Carrie didn't move back. His fingertips brushed her cheek, warm against the cold air, and Carrie closed her eyes for a single beat, accepting that there were things you couldn't solve with logic. The kiss didn't come fast, didn't burn, didn't perform. It was brief and steady, just enough contact for them both to understand they'd placed a promise on each other's mouth, that if they kept walking from here, they would walk by choice, not by debt, not by fear, and not by a door opened by mistake. That night there was no champagne, no stage lighting, and no flowery words to cover the seams of what had just been stitched back together, only the rare quiet after a storm and the small rain tapping steadily on the mansion's windows. A reminder that the world outside still existed, but for a few hours at least, it couldn't reach them. Piper was checked by the doctor, warmed through, given the sweet honey water she liked, and then, exhausted, she fell asleep right on the sofa, her head settling onto Carrie's lap as if that was the safest place her small body knew to find. Carrie sat perfectly still, one arm around Piper's shoulders, the other hand smoothing a sweat-damp curl off the child's forehead. And that softness, that warmth, tightened Carrie's throat, because only days ago she had cut contact to stand alone. And now a child was sleeping against her like an answer life was forcing her to accept. Mason stood across the living room, not saying much, only watching like a man who'd just walked out of hell and hadn't yet believed he was back. His gaze lingering on Piper, then on Carrie, and that look wasn't inspection or control anymore. It looked like someone learning how to ask permission. Only a few of Rafe's people moved quietly through the house to keep security tight, but they kept their distance, leaving a pocket of silence private enough to breathe in. Carrie thought of Leah, thought of Declan in cuffs, thought of the trafficking network still being tightened somewhere out there, thought of all the things that weren't finished, and that was exactly why this piece felt so fragile, like a glass set on the edge of a table. Mason came closer and sat in the single chair beside the sofa, not touching Piper, only reaching out to tug the blanket edge up so her shoulder wouldn't show. A clumsy motion, but earnest. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice tired and real. Carrie didn't look at him right away. She only looked at Piper. "I didn't," she said. "I disappeared on her for days. I was scared." Mason nodded like he understood, then fell silent for a long time, letting the rain speak for what was hard to say. When Carrie thought he'd stop there, Mason spoke again, low and steady, like he was placing a truth on the table. "I've lived for years by treating everything as a transaction," he said. "Who's loyal, who betrays, who pays. I thought I could control it all if I stayed cold enough." Carrie looked at him and saw the fatigue under his eyes cut deeper than usual. And suddenly she could see that coldness had saved him again and again, but it had also imprisoned him. Mason went on, his eyes never leaving Piper. "Today I understood there's something I don't want to pay for anymore. I don't want to open a door and wonder if someone's going to take what's mine." He paused for a beat, then turned fully to Carrie. And this time he didn't look away. "And I don't want you to walk out of this house like a guest. Not because I need a shield, because I need a right choice." Carrie tightened her arm around Piper just slightly, as if to keep herself steady. "Mason," she said, saying his name for the first time that night, and it left her mouth like a new boundary being drawn. Mason inhaled, and then he did something Carrie didn't expect. He didn't kneel. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He didn't deliver a prepared speech. He only reached into his pocket and took out a small ring. Simple, not overly glittering, more like a decision than a performance. He set the ring on the coffee table, not pressing it into her hand, not grabbing her, only placing it in the middle like a question the other person had the right to answer. "You can say no," he said, his voice rough. "And if you say no, I'll still keep my promise tonight. I just want you to know I'm choosing you, in the cleanest way I have." Carrie looked at the ring, then at Mason, and her heart didn't race like it had with a gun at her head. It felt heavy, like a door swinging open. She thought of the conditions she'd named, the work, the boundaries, the truth. And she knew if she nodded without naming those things again, she'd turn herself into the very object she'd sworn she wouldn't become. Carrie leaned down, keeping her voice low so she wouldn't wake Piper. "Yes," she said, and Mason blinked like a man who'd just been allowed to breathe. But Carrie lifted her hand right away, not to stop him, but to set the ground. "But I keep my autonomy," she said. "I keep working on my merit, not under your shadow. I keep the boundaries we named, and I want the truth, even when the truth makes you uncomfortable." Mason nodded without hesitation. "Done," he said. "All of it." Carrie held her hand out, unhurried, and only then did Mason pick up the ring and slide it onto her finger with a touch so gentle, it was like he was afraid of hurting her, afraid of breaking anything beautiful. Right then Piper stirred, her eyes cracking open in sleep. She saw Carrie's hand, saw the ring, then looked at Mason, and she didn't ask a long question. She only breathed out a small sound, like she was stamping what she wanted into place. "Don't disappear again," Piper said, sleepy but clear, then hugged tighter, pressing her cheek into Carrie's stomach, as if she could hold the promise in place with her own body. Carrie bent to kiss Piper's hair, tears falling without a sound, and Mason watched them both. And in that quiet, a proposal without a stage somehow became a choice, with more weight than any spotlight could ever give. The weeks that followed weren't loud the way the news is loud. There were no sensational headlines, only a life rhythm slowing down, like someone coming off a high fever and learning how to breathe normally again. Carrie didn't vanish from Northmark, and she didn't walk into the company with a kingpin's shadow hanging over her head. She held her exact role in crisis communications and operations, handled the hard files on her own, stood in meetings without needing Mason beside her. And when the remaining whispers tried to rise, they were put out quickly by results, not by power. She didn't change her life because of a powerful man. She changed the way she lived because of her own decisions, because she dared to say no when she had to, and dared to say yes when her heart was ready. Mason kept his promise too. He didn't interfere with her work unless she asked, and the conversations between them stopped being a chess match between the strong and the vulnerable, and became two adults, learning how to stand next to each other without swallowing each other whole. Piper went back to school with a tightened pickup plan, cameras thoroughly checked, and every afternoon she still ran to Carrie first before running to hug Mason, as if she had chosen her place for herself inside a family that wasn't perfect, but was real. Leah showed up from time to update them on the dismantling of the trafficking ring. While Declan faced the full weight of federal charges, Paige was also taken into custody. Her career and life were ruined by the very jealousy and debt that Declan had used to chain her to his trafficking network. Justice was slow, but it was absolute. In one private conversation, Leah told Carrie the fight wasn't over. There's always another layer, always other people in the dark. But she also admitted something rare, that if Carrie hadn't pulled the transfer location out of Declan's mouth that day, a child might have disappeared forever. Carrie didn't call herself a hero. She only knew she hadn't turned away when she was most afraid. And sometimes that's enough to change an ending. The house slowly began to smell like shared dinners instead of metal cold and planning. Piper's laughter came more often than radio chatter, and on the refrigerator door in the kitchen, there was a new drawing held up by a star-shaped magnet. 3 people standing side by side, holding hands, a roof colored in bright yellow above them, and underneath, in messy handwriting, the words, "Home is a choice." Carrie stood there looking at that drawing for a long time, then turned to Mason without needing to say anything more, because they both understood they had chosen each other not because of a life debt, not because they were afraid to lose, but because they wanted to build. This story doesn't claim power can save everything, and it doesn't claim love is a miracle that erases the past. It only reminds us that any door, even the one you open by mistake, can become a way home if you're brave enough to take responsibility for your own steps. In real life, we might not face the mafia or massive conspiracies, but we do face choices every day. The choice to stay silent or speak up. The choice to walk away or stay. The choice to become a victim or someone who changes the outcome. How did this story make you feel? Did anything in it make you think of your own life? Have you ever stood in front of a choice that changed your whole path? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear you from the deepest place in your heart. If this story gave you emotion and something to reflect on, please subscribe so you don't miss meaningful stories every day. And don't forget to like and share so more people can listen and feel understood too. We truly appreciate every view, every comment, and every bit of your support. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and see you again.